Eleanor Sullivan's knees pressed into the soft spring earth before the simple wooden cross. 5 years had weathered the marker, but William's name remained clear, carved deep by hands that had loved him. A light breeze whispered through the tall prairie grass surrounding the small plot at the edge of the property, carrying the sweet scent of wild violets. "Another year, William," she murmured, arranging the handful of bluebonnets she'd gathered at the base of the cross. "Our son would have been learning his letters by now." The absence felt like a physical presence beside her, not just William, but the child they'd never met, lost to the same fever that claimed her husband. Eleanor reached into her apron pocket and withdrew a small bundle wrapped in faded cotton. She unfolded it carefully, revealing a blood-stained strip of bandage, now brown with age. She placed it beside the flowers, a ritual she performed each year on this day, April 17th, 1878. "I'm still here," she said, though she wasn't entirely sure that was true. Her body remained certainly moving through the days tending the small farm, surviving. But the woman who had once been Eleanor Sullivan, union nurse with healing hands and a fierce heart, had largely disappeared when they'd buried William. From the hill where the grave sat, she could see the entirety of their homestead, the sturdy log cabin William had built with such hope, the small barn in need of repair, the chicken coop, and the modest vegetable garden just beginning to show the first green shoots of spring. Beyond stretched the endless Nebraska prairie, beautiful and merciless in its vastness. Eleanor rose, brushing dirt from her simple black dress. The wind picked up, tugging at her hair, pulling loose a few strands from the severe bun at the nape of her neck. At 36, her face remained handsome, though years of grief had etched fine lines around her eyes and mouth. Her movements, once quick and decisive in the chaos of field hospitals, had slowed to the deliberate pace of someone who saw little reason to hurry. Inside the cabin, she moved through her evening routine with mechanical precision. She prepared a simple meal, ate without tasting it, and cleaned up afterward. She checked the doors and windows, stoked the fire against the spring evening chill, and finally settled in the chair William had made for her as a wedding present. Sleep would not come easily tonight. It never did on this anniversary. When it finally claimed her, Eleanor's dreams carried her back to the war, as they often did. But tonight the dream was more vivid than usual, almost visceral in its clarity. She moved through the field hospital, the smell of blood and gangrene thick in the air. Outside, artillery fire punctuated the night in rhythmic booms. Her apron was stiff with dried blood, her hands red to the wrist despite frequent washing. She moved from cot to cot, checking bandages, offering water, whispering encouragement. "Nurse Sullivan," a voice called urgently. "They've brought more." She turned to see Dr. Harper gesturing toward the tent entrance. Men were carrying in stretchers, not wounded Union soldiers this time, but prisoners. Confederate soldiers, or what remained of them. Their blue uniforms and tatters, faces barely recognizable beneath bruises and dry blood. "Dear God," she whispered, rushing to the nearest man. His pulse was thready beneath her fingers, his breathing shallow. "What happened to them?" she demanded of the corporal who had accompanied the stretcher bearers. "Colonel Blackwood's interrogation," he replied flatly, not meeting her eyes. "This isn't interrogation," Dr. Harper hissed. "This is torture." The dying man's eyes fluttered open, startlingly blue against his bloodied face. He grasped Eleanor's wrist with surprising strength. "Tell my sister," he rasped. "Tell Rebecca I didn't—" His grip slackened before he could finish. Eleanor felt for a pulse, found none. "He's gone," she said, gently closing his eyes. "They all will be soon if we don't." "Nurse Sullivan." Eleanor looked up to find Lieutenant William Sullivan standing in the tent entrance. His uniform mud-splattered, his face grim. Her husband's eyes, the same startling blue as the dead prisoners, held a fury she recognized. "William, what are you doing here?" "I've seen what Blackwood is doing," he said, his voice low. "I'm going to testify against him. These men deserve better, even as enemies." Eleanor knew what this meant. Blackwood was powerful, vindictive. "It could cost you your commission," she warned. "It could cost more than that." William's jaw tightened. "Some evils must be confronted, Eleanor, no matter the cost." Eleanor woke with a gasp, her nightdress damp with sweat, the phantom smell of the field hospital still in her nostrils. She pressed a hand to her racing heart, willing it to slow. The cabin was dark except for the dying embers in the fireplace. Outside, an owl called, a lonely sound that matched the emptiness inside her. She rose from the bed, knowing sleep would not return now. Moving to the small desk in the corner, Eleanor lit a lamp and pulled out William's journal bound in worn leather. She had read it countless times, but tonight, driven by the vividness of her dream, she turned to the entries from April 1863. April 3rd, 1863. Witnessed something today that will haunt me forever. Colonel Blackwood's regiment captured a dozen Confederate soldiers last week. Today I saw what remained of them. Not men anymore, just broken things in blue uniforms. Court-martial proceedings begin tomorrow. I will testify to what I saw, though Blackwood's influence makes this dangerous. Some evils must be confronted even at great cost. I keep thinking of Eleanor safe at the field hospital. What would she say if she knew what I was about to do? She would tell me to speak truth regardless of consequence. Her moral compass is truer than mine. It is one of the countless reasons I love her. Eleanor closed the journal, her fingers lingering on William's neat handwriting. Her dream had been accurate. William had indeed testified against Blackwood, describing in detail the torture of Confederate prisoners. But the war's chaotic final years had swept away many such proceedings. Blackwood had emerged unscathed, his reputation perhaps tarnished, but his rank intact. And now, according to occasional news from town, he was a powerful man in the territory, owning the bank and several businesses in Kingston, the nearest settlement to Eleanor's homestead. Eleanor returned to bed but lay awake until dawn, painted the eastern sky with pale fingers of light. She rose mechanically and began her day as she always did, feeding the chickens, tending the small vegetable garden, mending a tear in the coop's wire. The sound of an approaching horse pulled her from her work. Visitors were rare at the Sullivan homestead. Eleanor straightened, shading her eyes against the morning sun as a rider came into view. Sheriff Nathaniel Reed sat tall in the saddle, his weathered face solemn beneath his hat. A man of few words, Reed had been one of the few people in Kingston who treated Eleanor with anything beyond awkward pity after William's death. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said, dismounting and removing his hat respectfully. "Sheriff," she acknowledged, "what brings you out this way?" Reed shifted his weight, a habit Eleanor had noticed whenever he was uncomfortable. "Thought you should know there's an auction in town today. Foster's Mill Properties." Eleanor waited, sensing there was more. "Everything's going under the hammer," Reed continued, "including his workers." "Workers?" Eleanor frowned. "3 women. Sisters." Reed looked down at his boots. "They're all in a family way." The words landed like stones in still water. 3 pregnant women being sold like cattle. For a moment, Eleanor felt something pierce through the protective numbness she'd cultivated for 5 years. Something hot and sharp that might have been anger or purpose. "Foster died owing a lot of people," Reed added. "Nobody's particularly interested in taking on 3 pregnant women as a liability." "And why would this interest me, Sheriff?" Eleanor asked, her voice flat. Reed met her eyes directly. "You sometimes attend these things." He wasn't wrong. Eleanor often went to auctions and foreclosures, not to purchase, but to witness, to see other lives dismantled piece by piece, as if watching others' losses might somehow validate her own. It was a bitter communion with grief that she couldn't explain to anyone. "The auction starts in an hour," Reed said, replacing his hat. "Just thought you might want to know." After he left, Eleanor stood motionless in the doorway. For reasons she couldn't articulate, the thought of 3 pregnant women being auctioned off disturbed her more deeply than usual. Perhaps it was the dream bringing the war's cruelties back to the surface of her mind. Perhaps it was the anniversary of William's death making her more raw than usual. Or perhaps it was simply that after 5 years of feeling almost nothing, anger was the first emotion strong enough to break through. An hour later, Eleanor found herself at the edge of the crowd gathered in the dusty yard behind what had once been Foster's Mill. She wore her one good dress, navy blue, which she hadn't worn since William's funeral. Her presence drew curious glances, but no one approached her. The widow Sullivan was a ghost among the living, a curiosity best left undisturbed. The auctioneer, a wiry man with yellow teeth, stood on a makeshift platform calling out items and accepting bids in a grating voice. Mill equipment went first, then Foster's wagon and horses. Each item represented another piece of a life dismantled. Eleanor watched with detached interest until the auctioneer called for the next lot. "And now, gentlemen, Foster's final assets." 3 women were led onto the platform. They stood close together, hands bound loosely before them with coarse rope. Eleanor felt her breath catch. The eldest, perhaps in her mid-20s, held her chin high despite the fear evident in her rigid posture. The middle sister kept her eyes downcast, her shoulders hunched as if trying to make herself smaller. The youngest couldn't have been more than 19, her delicate features tight with terror, one hand protectively cradling her swollen belly. The foster workers, the auctioneer announced, Catherine, Rebecca, and Josephine, all three carrying, as you can see. He gestured dismissively at their rounded abdomens. Liabilities, some might say, but others might see opportunity. Their indenture papers have 4 years remaining. A murmur ran through the crowd. Eleanor felt her heart rate quicken. She studied the women more carefully. The eldest sister, Catherine, scanned the crowd with defiant eyes that suddenly startlingly locked with Eleanor's own. Something in those eyes struck Eleanor like a physical blow. They were a deep, vivid blue William's eyes, and on her wrist, just visible where the rope had slid down, was a small scar in the shape of a crescent moon. Eleanor's mind flashed to William's journal. Father's new wife has a daughter from her previous marriage, just a tiny thing with a moon-shaped scar on her wrist. Strange to think I have a sister now, though I'll likely be gone to war before she's old enough to know me. Who will start the bidding at $10? The auctioneer called. Silence answered him. The men looked away, shuffling their feet. No one wanted 3 pregnant women, 3 extra mouths to feed that would soon become 6. Then a voice cut through the uncomfortable quiet. $10. Colonel Victor Blackwood stepped forward, his tall frame impeccably dressed despite the frontier setting. The former Union officer had established himself as a powerful man in the region after the war, owning the bank and half the businesses in town. His silver hair and beard gave him a distinguished appearance that belied the coldness in his eyes. The sisters stiffened visibly at his bid. Eleanor saw fear flash across their faces, not the generalized fear of uncertainty, but the specific terror of recognition. They knew Blackwood, and they feared him. $10 from Colonel Blackwood, the auctioneer announced, relief evident in his voice. Do I hear 15M? The silence returned, thicker this time. No one would bid against Blackwood. His influence in the town was too great, his retribution too certain. As if in a dream, Eleanor heard her own voice carry across the yard. $50. Every head turned toward her. Whispers rippled through the crowd as men shifted to get a better look at the widow who had broken her long silence. Blackwood turned slowly, his expression shifting from surprise to something harder as he recognized her. Mrs. Sullivan, he said, his deep South accent still pronounced after all these years. What possible use could you have for these women? Eleanor didn't answer him. She kept her eyes on the auctioneer. $50, she repeated. Blackwood's face darkened. 75, he countered. 100, Eleanor responded immediately. The crowd's whispers grew louder. This was far more than 3 indentured pregnant women were worth in practical terms. Blackwood's eyes narrowed as he studied Eleanor, clearly trying to discern her motivation. 150, he said, a challenge in his voice. Eleanor met his gaze steadily. 200. It was everything. She had the entirety of her savings from 5 years of barely subsisting on her small farm. For a moment, she thought Blackwood would continue bidding out of pure spite. But after a tense silence, he gave a dismissive wave of his hand. Let the widow have them, he said, his voice carrying a promise of future reckoning. They'll be her ruin. The auctioneer, clearly eager to conclude this unexpected confrontation, brought his gavel down quickly. Sold to Mrs. Sullivan for $200. Eleanor approached the platform, aware of every eye following her movements. She paid the auctioneer from a small leather pouch, the coins heavy in her palm. Then she turned to the 3 sisters, who watched her with expressions caught between hope and dread. She pulled a small knife from her pocket, the one she used for mending harnesses, and cut through the ropes binding their wrists. She didn't speak. She simply turned and began walking out of the yard, expecting them to follow. As she passed Blackwood, he stepped closer, his voice low enough that only she could hear. You've made a grave mistake today, Mrs. Sullivan. Your husband isn't here to protect you anymore. Eleanor looked up at him, meeting his gaze without flinching. I never needed his protection, she said quietly. I only wanted his company. She continued walking, feeling the sisters fall into step behind her. She could sense Blackwood's eyes boring into her. Back could feel the weight of his hatred. But for the first time in 5 years, the crushing weight of her grief felt lighter, replaced by something sharper and more immediate. The journey to the homestead was silent and arduous. The four women walked the dusty road without speaking, the afternoon sun beating down on them mercilessly. Eleanor led the way, her pace steady and unhurried. The sisters followed a few steps behind, occasionally whispering among themselves. As they crested the final hill, Eleanor stopped. From this vantage point, her small farm spread out below them, the cabin, the weathered barn, the chicken coop, and the small vegetable garden. Everything was meticulously maintained, but lifeless, a monument to routine without purpose. The four women stood in silence, looking down at what would now be their shared home. The setting sun cast long shadows across the land, painting the prairie in strokes of gold and amber. A stillness settled over them, broken only by the occasional call of a meadowlark. Josephine, the youngest sister, suddenly placed a hand on her swollen belly. "The baby is kicking," she said softly. "First time in many days." A meadowlark trilled nearby, its sweet notes carrying on the evening breeze. Eleanor felt an unexpected tightness in her throat, a stinging in her eyes that she hadn't experienced in years. The sensation was so foreign that it took her a moment to recognize it as emotion, not grief this time, but something she couldn't quite name. Something like hope. "This is it," Eleanor said, her voice breaking the spell. "This is where you'll live and work until your indenture is complete." The three sisters looked at the homestead with expressions that mingled relief and apprehension. "Thank you, ma'am," Catherine said, her voice stronger than her exhausted appearance suggested. "I didn't buy you out of charity," Eleanor interrupted. "I need help with the farm. You'll earn your keep." She began walking again, leading them down the hill toward the cabin. As they approached, a figure moved in the shadows of the tree line to the east. Two men on horseback watched from a distance, partially concealed by the deepening twilight. The taller man lowered a spyglass, revealing a face marked by a deep scar running from temple to jaw. "She bought them," he said to his companion, his voice a low growl. The second man, dressed too finely for the frontier in a tailored suit and polished boots, nodded. "Blackwood won't be pleased." "What now?" the scarred man asked. "We watch," the well-dressed man replied. "And wait. She has no idea what she's just purchased." A cold smile crossed his face. "Or who?" They turned their horses and rode away, leaving the four women to enter the cabin as night fell across the Nebraska prairie. Inside, Eleanor lit the lamps and showed the sisters their sleeping area, a curtained-off space that had once been used for storage. "You'll sleep there," she said, pointing. "There are blankets. You can arrange it as you need to." She indicated the hearth and the small pantry beside it. "Food is there, don't waste it. Water comes from the well outside. The privy is behind the barn." Her instructions were clipped, impractical, devoid of warmth. Questions, the sisters exchanged glances. Rebecca, the middle one, spoke hesitantly. What work will we be doing, ma'am?" "Whatever needs doing," Eleanor replied. "The garden needs tending. The cabin needs cleaning. The barn needs repair." "We can cook," Josephine, the youngest, offered quietly. "And sew," Rebecca added. Eleanor nodded curtly. "Good, you'll need those skills." She turned away from them and began removing items from the pantry to prepare a simple meal. "Rest today. Work begins tomorrow." The sisters retreated to the curtained area, their whispers barely audible as they settled into their new space. Eleanor worked mechanically, trying to ignore the strange intrusion of life into her carefully maintained solitude. For 5 years, she had lived alone with her grief, her daily routines as rigid and unchanging as the seasons. Now there were other heartbeats under her roof, other breaths disturbing the silence. She set out 4 plates for the first time since William died. The simple act felt sacrilegious somehow, as if she were betraying the sanctity of her grief. When she called the sisters to eat, they emerged cautiously from behind the curtain. They sat together on one side of the table, leaving Eleanor alone on the other. No one spoke as they ate the simple meal of beans and cornbread. As Catherine reached for the water pitcher, her sleeve pulled back slightly, revealing again the crescent-shaped scar on her wrist. Eleanor noticed but said nothing, though her mind raced with questions. How could these women be connected to William? Was it merely coincidence that Catherine had the same scar? William had described the same startling blue eyes. After the meal, as the sisters cleaned up, Eleanor sat on the porch with William's journal. She often read his entries in the evenings, a ritual of remembrance. Tonight she found herself unable to focus on the familiar words. Her mind kept returning to Catherine's eyes, that impossible blue, and to the moment at the auction when she had outbid Blackwood. The sound of soft singing drew Eleanor from her thoughts. Rebecca was humming a gentle melody as they finished their chores. The simple tune floated through the cabin, achingly sweet in its normalcy. Eleanor recognized the song with a jolt. It was an old Union ballad, one William had often hummed as he worked around the farm. How would Rebecca know it? Eleanor closed the journal and went inside. The singing stopped abruptly as she entered. The sisters looked at her apprehensively as if expecting a rebuke. "I'll be up at dawn," Eleanor said, ignoring the sudden silence. "I expect you to be ready to work then." They nodded their understanding and she retreated to her bed in the corner of the cabin. She lay awake long after the sisters had settled behind their curtain, listening to the rhythm of their breathing in the darkness. Their presence felt like an invasion, disturbing the carefully preserved memorial she had made of her life. Yet as sleep finally began to claim her, Eleanor realized that for the first time in 5 years, she was looking forward to the morning. Dawn broke in streaks of gold and pink across the endless Nebraska sky. Eleanor was already up building a fire in the hearth when the sisters emerged from behind the curtain. They looked rested but wary, uncertain of what the day would bring. Eleanor nodded toward the pantry. "Make breakfast," she instructed. "Then we'll see what you can do." She went outside to feed the chickens and check on her horse, leaving the sisters to manage the morning meal. When she returned, she found the table set and a pot of porridge bubbling on the hearth. Catherine was kneading dough for bread, her movements practiced and efficient. They ate in the same silence as the night before, but this time Eleanor observed the sisters more carefully. Catherine, the eldest, had an air of quiet authority. She was tall and straight-backed, despite her pregnancy, with strong hands and watchful eyes. Rebecca, the middle sister, was more delicate in build, her movements graceful. There was a musicality to her, even in the way she lifted her spoon. Josephine, the youngest, had a softer quality to her, but Eleanor noticed how she studied the herbs hanging from the ceiling beams with keen interest. After breakfast, Eleanor assigned them tasks. Catherine would help repair the chicken coop, Rebecca would wash the accumulated laundry, and Josephine would weed the struggling vegetable garden. "Can you use tools?" Eleanor asked Catherine as they walked to the chicken coop. "Yes, ma'am," Catherine replied. "Our father was a carpenter before—" She trailed off. "Before what?" Catherine hesitated. "Before the war changed everything." Eleanor handed her a hammer. "The west wall needs reinforcing. The coyotes nearly got in last month." They worked side by side in silence, the rhythmic sound of their hammers filling the morning air. Catherine was indeed skilled with tools, her movements sure and practiced. Occasionally, Eleanor caught her wincing and placing a hand on her swollen belly, but she never complained. "How far along are you?" Eleanor asked finally. "7 months, I think," Catherine replied. "Rebecca is about 6, Josephine 5. Eleanor nodded, not asking the obvious questions about the fathers. That wasn't her business. "You should rest when you need to," she said, her voice still matter-of-fact. "I need workers, not martyrs." Catherine gave her a searching look. "Why did you buy us Mrs. Sullivan, really?" Eleanor drove another nail into the wood with more force than necessary. "I told you, I need help with the farm." "You outbid Colonel Blackwood," Catherine pressed. "That seems like more than just needing farmhands." Eleanor put down her hammer and turned to face Catherine fully. "I know what men like Blackwood do to women like you," she said bluntly. "I was a nurse during the war. I've seen what happens to vulnerable people when predators have power." Catherine's blue eyes, those unsettlingly familiar eyes, widened slightly. "You were a nurse in the Union Army." "Yes, that's how I met my husband." "William Sullivan," Catherine said softly, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. Eleanor's attention sharpened. "You know of him?" Catherine looked away, picking up her hammer again. "I've heard the name. People in town speak of him sometimes." Eleanor wasn't convinced, but she didn't press further. They resumed working, but she could feel Catherine's gaze on her, periodically assessing and curious. It made her uncomfortable, as if the younger woman could somehow see past the barriers she had so carefully constructed around her heart. By midday, the homestead had taken on a different rhythm. Rebecca had hung washing on the line the first time clothes had danced in the Nebraska wind at the Sullivan farm in years. Josephine had cleared half the garden of weeds and was carefully examining the struggling plants. The sound of women's voices, quiet conversations, occasional instructions broke the silence that had defined the place for so long. Eleanor retreated to the barn to check her supplies, needing a moment away from the strange transformation of her home. The familiar scent of hay and leather surrounded her as she counted sacks of grain and checked the condition of her tools. This was her routine, her control, the ordered existence she had created from the chaos of loss. Mrs. Sullivan. Eleanor turned to find Josephine standing hesitantly in the barn doorway, a bundle of herbs in her arms. I found these growing wild at the edge of your garden, the young woman said. Yarrow and comfrey, good for healing. May I dry them? Eleanor studied the girl. Josephine's face was open, her eyes brown and like her sister's blue, bright with intelligence. You know herbs, Josephine nodded, a flicker of animation crossing her features. My grandmother was a healer. She taught me what plants can heal and what plants can harm. She gestured to the garden. You have some good medicinal herbs here, though they need care. Show me, Eleanor said, surprising herself as much as Josephine. For the next hour, Josephine led Eleanor through the garden, pointing out plants and explaining their properties. The young woman's knowledge was impressive, her quiet voice gaining confidence as she spoke of her grandmother's teachings. Feverfew for headaches, comfrey for bones that won't heal, echinacea for fighting illness before it takes hold, Josephine explained. Grandmother said, knowing plants is knowing life's secrets. Eleanor found herself remembering her own medical training, the frantic battlefield hospitals, where herbal remedies often supplemented dwindling medical supplies. Your grandmother was right, she said. During the war, herbs sometimes saved more lives than doctors. Josephine smiled for the first time since arriving at the homestead. It transformed her face, revealing dimples in her cheeks. You really were a nurse, she said. You mentioned it to Catherine. I was for 3 years. That's why you have the medical books, Josephine said, nodding toward the cabin. Eleanor frowned. What medical books? On the high shelf behind the flour barrel. I saw them when we were making breakfast. Josephine's smile faded, replaced by worry. I'm sorry, I wasn't snooping. It's all right, Eleanor interrupted. You have good eyes. She had indeed kept her medical texts, though she rarely looked at them anymore. They were relics of another life, like William's rifle and journal. By late afternoon, the homestead had been transformed in small but significant ways. The chicken coop was repaired, laundry hung on the line, the garden half weeded and assessed. Inside, the cabin had been swept and dusted, the hearth cleaned, and bread was rising near the fire. Eleanor stood on the porch watching the setting sun paint the prairie in shades of gold and crimson. The day's work had been productive, more so than any day in recent memory. The sisters had proven capable and diligent despite their condition. And for the first time in 5 years, Eleanor had spent a day thinking of something besides her grief. A movement at the edge of her property caught her attention. A rider approached slowly, his figure silhouetted against the setting sun. As he drew closer, Eleanor recognized Sheriff Reed. She tensed, wondering what brought him to her homestead so soon after the auction. The sisters had retreated inside at the sight of the approaching rider, their instinctive wariness another reminder of their past treatment. Reed dismounted and removed his hat as he approached the porch. Evening, Mrs. Sullivan, he said, his expression troubled. Sheriff, she acknowledged. What brings you out here? Reed glanced toward the cabin, where the sisters' shadows were visible through the window. Wanted to make sure everything was all right with your new acquisitions. We're managing, Eleanor replied. Is that all? Reed shifted uncomfortably. There's talk in town about you buying those women, about you crossing Blackwood. People should mind their own business. Blackwood makes it his business, Reed said, lowering his voice. He was asking questions about your land today. Eleanor's attention sharpened. What kind of questions? About your deed, about whether you've kept up with property taxes. Reed looked genuinely concerned. He seemed particularly interested in the south section by the creek. My papers are in order, Eleanor said firmly. William made sure of that before he died. Reed nodded. I believe you, but Blackwood has ways of complicating things, especially for women alone. He glanced at the cabin again. Or women in difficult circumstances. I can handle Blackwood, Eleanor said, though she felt a flicker of unease. Reed studied her face for a moment. You know, you remind me of someone, he said unexpectedly. Can't quite place who, but there's something familiar about you. Eleanor stiffened. Is there anything else, Sheriff? Reed replaced his hat. Just be careful, Mrs. Sullivan. Blackwood doesn't forget a slight, and he's got reason to dislike you beyond today's auction. What do you mean? Reed mounted his horse before answering. Your husband, Lieutenant William Sullivan. He testified against Blackwood during the war, didn't he? Something about mistreatment of prisoners. Eleanor's surprise must have shown on her face because Reed nodded grimly. Small world, Mrs. Sullivan. Word gets around and even years later, even out here. As he rode away, Eleanor remained on the porch processing this new complication. If Reed knew about William's testimony against Blackwood, then Blackwood certainly remembered it too. Her bid at the auction hadn't just been a current affront, it had reopened an old wound. She turned and entered the cabin, finding the three sisters huddled near the hearth, their faces anxious. "Was that trouble?" Catherine asked directly. "Not yet," Eleanor replied, "but it might be coming." She moved to the pantry and reached behind the flour barrel, pulling down the medical texts Josephine had noticed earlier. She hadn't opened them in years, but now she ran her fingers over the worn leather bindings, feeling something stir within her, a memory of purpose, of skill, of a time when she had been more than just a vessel for grief. "Catherine," she said, making a sudden decision, "tomorrow I'm going to teach you how to shoot." That night, long after the sisters had fallen asleep behind their curtain, Eleanor sat at the table with a single candle burning. She opened William's journal to an entry she had read countless times before. April 3rd, 1863. "Witnessed something today that will haunt me. Colonel Blackwood's regiment captured a dozen Confederate soldiers last week. Today I saw what remained of them. Not men anymore, just broken things in blue uniforms. Court-martial proceedings begin tomorrow. I will testify to what I saw, though Blackwood's reputation makes this dangerous. Some evils must be confronted even at great cost. I keep thinking of Eleanor safe at the field hospital. What would she say if she knew what I was about to do? She would tell me to speak truth regardless of consequence. Her moral compass is truer than mine. It is one of the countless reasons I love her." Eleanor closed the journal and looked toward the curtained corner where the sisters slept. She had acted today without fully understanding why, driven by some instinct she hadn't felt in years. Perhaps it was Catherine's eyes so hauntingly familiar. Perhaps it was the memory of who she had been during the war. Not just William's wife, but Nurse Sullivan, a woman who fought death with every skill at her disposal. Or perhaps it was simply that, faced with the choice between continued emptiness and dangerous purpose, some part of her had chosen life. She opened one of the medical texts and began to read, reacquainting herself with knowledge long dormant. If trouble was coming, she would be prepared not just for herself, but for the 6 lives now under her protection. Outside, the Nebraska wind continued its lonely song across the plains. But inside the cabin, for the first time in 5 years, Eleanor Sullivan was planning for tomorrow. The Winchester kicked against Eleanor's shoulder with familiar force. The tin can perched on the fence post 50 yards away danced and clattered to the ground. "Again," Eleanor said, handing the rifle to Catherine. The morning sun cast long shadows across the east field as Catherine positioned the rifle against her shoulder, mimicking Eleanor's stance. Her pregnancy made the posture awkward, but her hands were steady as they gripped the weapon. "Remember to breathe out as you squeeze the trigger," Eleanor instructed. "Don't pull, squeeze." Catherine nodded, her blue eyes narrowing in concentration. She took aim, exhaled slowly, and fired. The can on the next post wobbled, but remained standing. "Almost," Eleanor said. "You're anticipating the recoil. Try again." A week had passed since the auction. Spring had fully taken hold of the Nebraska plains, painting the previously barren landscape with tentative strokes of green. The homestead had undergone a similar transformation. Laundry fluttered on the line. The garden showed neat rows of tender shoots. Chicken scratch marks dotted the yard. And each morning before the day's work began, Eleanor taught Catherine to shoot. Rebecca emerged from the cabin carrying a basket of mending. She settled on the porch, her eyes occasionally darting to the shooting lesson with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Of the three sisters, she remained the most reserved, startling at loud noises, and keeping her eyes downcast when Eleanor asked direct questions. Catherine fired again. This time the can flew from the post. "Better," Eleanor nodded. "5 more rounds, then we start the day's work." As Catherine reloaded, Eleanor glanced toward the cabin. Josephine was tending to her newly expanded herb garden, her hands moving with the certainty of someone who knew plants as old friends. In the short time since their arrival, the youngest sister had proven herself not just knowledgeable about herbs, but gifted with them. Under her care, plants that had withered for years now thrived. Eleanor had begun working with her in the evenings, comparing Josephine's folk remedies with her own medical training. It was the closest thing to companionship she had experienced since William's death. Catherine fired the remaining rounds, hitting 3 of her 5 targets. She lowered the rifle with a small smile of satisfaction. "You're improving," Eleanor acknowledged, taking the weapon back. "Tomorrow we'll try moving targets." "Do you really think he'll come?" Catherine asked quietly. "Blackwood." Eleanor began cleaning the rifle with practiced movements. "I don't know, but it's better to be prepared." She didn't share her deeper concerns with the sisters. Sheriff Reed had visited twice more in the past week, each time with troubling news. Blackwood had been making inquiries about her property deed. Rumor had it he'd hired men to survey the land along the creek that marked her southern boundary. Most worrying, there had been strangers in town asking about the Sullivan woman and her new help. "I could teach Rebecca and Josephine too," Catherine suggested. Eleanor considered this as she finished cleaning the rifle. "Rebecca isn't ready. She's too nervous. She'd be more dangerous to herself than anyone else. But Josephine might learn." She slung the rifle over her shoulder. "For now, one shooter is enough. Let's get to work." The day unfolded with the rhythm they had established in the weeks since the sisters' arrival. Catherine repaired fence posts along the eastern perimeter. Rebecca did the washing and then helped Eleanor smoke meat for her storage. Josephine tended her garden and prepared medicines from her herbs. By mid-afternoon, dark clouds had gathered on the horizon, promising a spring storm. Eleanor found herself checking the sky periodically as she worked with Rebecca to hang the smoked meat in the smokehouse. "We should secure everything before that storm hits," she said. "Tell Catherine to bring in the tools from the east field." Rebecca nodded and hurried away. Eleanor watched her go, noting how the young woman's gait had changed as her pregnancy advanced. All 3 sisters were showing more prominently now, their bodies changing with the passing weeks. Eleanor found herself increasingly aware of their conditions, mentally calculating dates and preparing for what was to come. She would need to review her midwifery knowledge soon. It had been years since she'd delivered a baby, and even then, it had been under the guidance of more experienced nurses. The thought both terrified and energized her. For so long, she had lived in stasis, preserving the past, rather than building for the future. Now suddenly life was asserting itself into her carefully maintained shrine to grief. A flash of movement at the edge of her property caught her attention. Instinctively, she reached for the rifle that was no longer slung across her back. She had left it in the cabin after the morning's lesson. She squinted against the darkening sky. There was a rider moving along her southern boundary near the creek. Then another. "Catherine," she called, "get inside." Catherine appeared from the direction of the east field carrying tools. She saw Eleanor's expression and immediately understood, dropping the tools and hurrying toward the cabin. Rebecca emerged from the barn looking confused until Eleanor gestured urgently for her to follow. Inside, Josephine was at the table grinding herbs with a mortar and pestle. She looked up in alarm as they entered. "What is it?" she asked. "Riders," Eleanor said tersely, moving to where the rifle stood in the corner. She checked that it was loaded. "On the south boundary?" Catherine moved to the window, peering out cautiously. "Blackwood's men?" "Likely." Eleanor handed Catherine the rifle. "Stay inside, all of you. I'm going to see what they want." "Mrs. Sullivan," Rebecca began, her voice trembling. "Stay inside," Eleanor repeated firmly. She took William's revolver from its box on the high shelf and checked its chambers. "If they come to the house, Catherine knows what to do." Outside, the wind had picked up, bending the prairie grass and bringing the scent of rain. Eleanor tucked the revolver into the pocket of her apron and walked purposefully toward the creek. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her stride was steady. She spotted the riders again, 2 men on horseback, methodically moving along the creek, stopping occasionally to examine the ground or make notes. They wore city clothes rather than the practical attire of farmers or ranchers. Surveyors then, just as Reed had warned. Eleanor approached them directly, refusing to skulk around her own property. The men noticed her when she was about 50 yards away. They exchanged a glance before one nudged his horse forward to meet her. "Afternoon, ma'am," he called, touching the brim of his hat. He was perhaps 40, with a neat beard and spectacles that gave him a scholarly appearance. "Fine piece of land you have here." "You're trespassing," Eleanor replied, stopping at a distance that kept both men in her sight. The man smiled apologetically. "We're just doing a bit of surveying, ma'am. Public service." "This is private property," Eleanor said, "and I don't recall requesting any surveying." The second man joined his companion. He was younger, with sharp features and a less conciliatory manner. "We're working for Colonel Blackwood," he said bluntly. He's interested in purchasing water rights along this creek. The creek is on my land, Eleanor stated, and I'm not selling. There seems to be some question about the exact boundary line, Mrs. Sullivan, the older man supplied. There's no question. I have the deed. Deeds can be imprecise, the younger man said, especially older ones. Colonel Blackwood believes the creek may actually mark the boundary rather than being contained within your property. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and the first heavy drops of rain began to fall. Eleanor stood her ground, feeling the water soak into her dress and hair. My deed is clear, she said. The creek runs through my property, not along its edge. And now I'd like you both to leave. The younger man's expression hardened. We're not finished with our survey. Eleanor's hand slipped into her apron pocket, fingers closing around the revolver. Yes, she said quietly, you are. Something in her tone made both men tense. The older surveyor studied her face, then nodded slowly. We'll come back when the weather is better, he said clearly, trying to ease the tension. Perhaps we can speak with your husband then. My husband is dead, Eleanor cut him off, and I speak for this property. Do not come back. She stood immobile as they turned their horses and rode away, waiting until they were well beyond her boundary before allowing her shoulders to slump. The rain was falling steadily now, plastering her dress to her body and running in rivulets down her face. When she returned to the cabin, soaked and mud-spattered, the sisters were waiting anxiously by the door. Blackwood's surveyors, she confirmed as she stepped inside, dripping water onto the wooden floor. They're claiming there's a question about the property line at the creek. Catherine's jaw tightened. He won't stop, will he? No, Eleanor said, removing her sodden apron. He won't. Josephine brought her a towel, her young face creased with worry. Why does he want your land so badly? Eleanor dried her hair, considering the question. I don't know. The creek is valuable for water rights, but there are other water sources in the region. There must be something more. Rebecca, who had been unusually quiet even for her, spoke up unexpectedly. Gold, she said softly. The other three women turned to look at her. What did you say? Eleanor asked. Rebecca swallowed visibly. When I worked in town, in one of Blackwood's establishments, I overheard things. Men talk freely around women they don't respect. Her cheeks flushed with shame, but she continued. Last year, there was talk about gold being found in a creek south of town. Blackwood was very interested. He sent men to find the exact location. Eleanor sat down heavily at the table. Gold in my creek. I don't know if it's your creek specifically, Rebecca said, but it would explain why he wants the land. The implications settled over the room like the gathering storm outside. If there was gold on her property, Blackwood would stop at nothing to acquire it. We need to find out for certain, Eleanor said finally. Tomorrow when the storm passes, we'll check the creek ourselves. The rest of the evening passed in tense silence. The storm raged outside, rain lashing against the windows and thunder shaking the small cabin. Eleanor found herself repeatedly checking that the rifle was loaded and within reach, startling at every sound that might indicate riders approaching through the downpour. The sisters huddled near the hearth, whispering among themselves. Occasionally, Eleanor caught fragments of their conversation, concerns about Blackwood, about their futures, about the babies they carried. As the night deepened and the storm began to subside, Eleanor made a decision. I need to know more about the three of you, she said abruptly, turning from the window to face the sisters. If we're to face Blackwood together, I need to understand what we're dealing with. The sisters exchanged glances. Catherine, as always, took the lead. What do you want to know? Everything, Eleanor said. How you came to be indentured to Foster. What you know about Blackwood. Who fathered your children? She paused. And why your eyes look so much like my husband's. Catherine's hand went instinctively to her throat where a small locket hung on a thin chain, a detail Eleanor had noticed but not commented on before. Catherine began hesitantly. We have all night, Eleanor replied, sitting down across from them. And I think it's time for truth between us. Before Catherine could answer, a piercing scream tore through the night, Josephine's voice high and terrified. Eleanor whirled to find the youngest sister bolt upright on her pallet, eyes wide and unseeing, her face a mask of horror. No, Josephine cried. No, please, not again. Catherine rushed to her sister, gathering her in her arms. Shh, Joe, it's just a dream, just a dream. Josephine's eyes focused slowly, recognition returning. She was shaking violently, her nightdress damp with sweat. It was so real, she whispered. So real. What did you see? Eleanor asked, kneeling beside them. Josephine looked at her with haunted eyes. Men in uniforms, blue uniforms, a tent with wounded, and she stopped her, breath catching. And what, Josephine? Eleanor pressed gently. A man dying, so young. His eyes were blue like Catherine's. He was trying to speak to tell him upon something important, about his sister. Josephine's voice dropped to a whisper. He said, tell Rebecca I didn't, but then he died. Eleanor felt as if the floor had dropped away beneath her. This was her dream, her memory from the field hospital. The dying Confederate soldier with blue eyes. Rebecca had gone pale, her hands clutching the edge of the table. How could you know that? She stammered. Josephine shook her head helplessly. I see things sometimes. Things that have happened. Things that might happen. Grandmother said it was a gift and a curse. Could you draw his face? Eleanor asked, her voice unsteady. The soldier in your dream. Josephine nodded slowly. Eleanor retrieved paper and a pencil from William's desk and placed them before the young woman. With trembling fingers, Josephine began to sketch. The cabin was silent except for the scratching of the pencil and the occasional rumble of distant thunder. Catherine and Rebecca watched, their faces tense. Eleanor stood behind Josephine, her heart pounding as the face emerged on the paper. It was him, the dying Confederate soldier from her memory, rendered with uncanny accuracy. But there was more. As the features took shape, Eleanor saw what she had missed in the chaos of the field hospital, the resemblance to William. The same high forehead, the same straight nose, the same determined chin. Who is he? Rebecca whispered, staring at the drawing. Eleanor looked at Catherine, whose face had gone ashen. I think, Eleanor said slowly, that he might be your brother. Catherine reached for the locket at her throat, opening it with shaking hands. Inside was a small, faded photograph of a man with startlingly blue eyes. The same eyes that looked out from Catherine's face from the drawing of the dead soldier. Our father, Catherine said softly, holding out the locket for Eleanor to see. Jonathan Winters. The name hit Eleanor like a physical blow. Jonathan Winters, William's father. That's not possible, she whispered. William never mentioned having sisters. Half-sisters, Catherine clarified. Different mothers. Our mother was Jonathan's second wife after William's mother died. William was already grown and gone by then, joined the army before we were born. I don't think he even knew about us. Eleanor's mind raced, trying to process this revelation. William had rarely spoken of his family, saying only that they had died or scattered during the war. He had been an only child, his mother dead of consumption when he was young, his father a distant figure who had remarried. How did you end up here? She managed to ask. In Nebraska, indentured to foster. Catherine's fingers traced the outline of the locket. When father died during the war, our mother tried to keep the family together, but it was hard. She fell ill. Before she died, she gave me this locket with father's picture inside. She made me promise to keep our family together. After she died, we had nowhere to go, Ruth continued softly. We moved west looking for work. That's when, she trailed off, looking down at her hands. That's when Rebecca ended up working for Blackwood. Catherine finished for her. I was working as a seamstress in town. Josephine was too young to work, so she stayed with me. When I found out what kind of place Rebecca was in, I tried to get her out, but Blackwood wouldn't release her indenture. Catherine continued. Then Mr. Foster offered to buy all 3 of our contracts. He needed help at the mill and with his house. He wasn't kind exactly, but he was fair, better than Blackwood. And the fathers of your children? Eleanor asked. The sisters fell silent. It was Rebecca who finally answered, her voice barely audible over the diminishing rain. Mine is one of Blackwood's men, she said. I didn't have a choice. Josephine reached for her sister's hand. Mine is a boy from town. We were sweet on each other, but when he found out about the baby, he left. Catherine straightened her shoulders. Mine was my intended. He died of fever before we could marry. Eleanor absorbed this information, her world tilting on its axis. These women, these girls really were William's family, his half-sisters, which made them... We're family, she said, the words strange on her tongue. William was your half-brother. I'm your sister-in-law. Catherine nodded. When I saw you at the auction, I recognized you from the description William had written in his letters to father. She looked down. He wrote about his nurse wife with the healing hands and fierce heart. I knew it was you, but I wasn't sure you'd want to acknowledge us. You knew who I was at the auction? Eleanor asked, stunned by this revelation. Yes, Catherine admitted. I was hoping you'd see the resemblance, that you'd help us. But I didn't expect you to buy our indenture. I didn't know, Eleanor said numbly. I didn't recognize the connection. I only knew that your eyes. She stopped, overwhelmed by the implications. William never knew about you. He would have searched for you if he had. We tried to find him after the war, Josephine said, but we had no address, no way to locate him. Then we heard from a returning soldier that Lieutenant William Sullivan had settled in Nebraska with his wife. We were trying to save enough to travel here when everything fell apart. Rebecca finished. Eleanor stood and walked to the shelf where she kept William's few possessions. She took down a wooden box and returned to the table. From it, she removed a packet of letters tied with a faded ribbon. These are from William to me during the war, she said. There's one where he mentions his father remarrying, but he never spoke of siblings. She sifted through the letters until she found the one she sought. Here, she read aloud, Father has remarried a younger woman named Elizabeth. I've not met her being occupied with this war, but I hope she brings him happiness in his final years. I sometimes regret our estrangement, but the path I've chosen is the right one, even if he cannot see it. Eleanor looked up at the sisters. He and his father disagreed about the war. Jonathan didn't want William to fight for the Union. Catherine nodded. Father wasn't political, but he feared losing his only son. After William left, though, Father changed. He began supporting the Union cause quietly. That's how he met our mother. She was organizing supplies for Union soldiers. The revelation settled over Eleanor like a heavy blanket. All these years she had thought herself alone in the world, her only family connection severed with William's death. Now suddenly she had 3 sisters-in-law, soon to be 3 nieces or nephews. Does Blackwood know about this connection? She asked sharply. The sisters exchanged glances again. I don't think so, Catherine said. We never spoke of our family to anyone in town. It wasn't safe to advertise Union connections in some places even after the war. Eleanor nodded, her mind working rapidly. Good, let's keep it that way for now. She looked at each sister in turn. This changes things, but it also makes our situation more dangerous. If Blackwood realizes you're connected to William, it will only strengthen his resolve against us. What will we do? Josephine asked, her hand unconsciously moving to her swollen belly. Eleanor's jaw set in a determined line. First, we confirm whether there's gold in that creek. Then we secure our legal position and we prepare for whatever comes next. She stood feeling more resolute than she had in years. These weren't just 3 random women she had saved on impulse. They were family Williams' blood. Protecting them wasn't just an act of defiance against Blackwood. It was an obligation to her husband's memory. Get some rest, she told the sisters. Tomorrow will be a long day. As the sisters settled back behind their curtain, Eleanor returned to the table, staring at Josephine's drawing in the flickering lamplight. The face of the dying soldier o' Winters. Perhaps another brother or cousin these women had lost seemed to watch her with William's eyes. Outside, the storm had finally passed, leaving a washed, clean world under a sky brilliant with stars. Eleanor stepped onto the porch, breathing in the rain-cleansed air. The prairie stretched before her, vast and mysterious in the moonlight. For 5 years, she had been a ghost in her own life, moving through days without purpose or passion. Now, standing under the immense Nebraska sky, Eleanor felt something long dormant stirring within her: determination, resolve, perhaps even hope. She wasn't just Eleanor Sullivan anymore, widow and recluse. She was Eleanor Sullivan, protector of William's family, guardian of his legacy. And she would face whatever came with all the strength and skill that had once made her one of the most respected nurses on the battlefield. The wind carried the scent of rain and wild sage across the plains. Eleanor lifted her face to it, feeling truly alive for the first time since they had buried William beneath the prairie soil. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges: gold to find, boundaries to defend, preparations to make. But tonight, in this moment of quiet after the storm, Eleanor allowed herself to simply feel the wonder of it, of family found, of purpose, renewed, of a future suddenly worth fighting for. The morning after the storm dawned clear and bright, the Nebraska sky washed clean of clouds. Eleanor rose early, her sleep having been fitful and filled with dreams of William and his unknown sisters. She moved quietly around the cabin, careful not to wake the women still sleeping behind the curtain. The revelation of the previous night had shifted something fundamental within her. For 5 years, she had defined herself solely as William's widow, preserving his memory in amber, unchanging and eternal. Now she found herself guardian to his family sisters he had never known, carrying children who would be his nieces or nephews. The weight of this responsibility pressed against her chest, but unlike the crushing weight of grief, this burden somehow made breathing easier. Eleanor stepped onto the porch, breathing in the fresh scent of rain-washed earth. The storm had left the world renewed, droplets of water clinging to grass blades and catching the early morning light like scattered diamonds. "You're up early." Eleanor turned to find Catherine standing in the doorway. Even in the simple nightdress, her pregnancy prominent, there was a strength to her posture that reminded Eleanor of William. "I've always been an early riser," Eleanor replied. More so since she didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Catherine nodded, understanding in her blue eyes, William's eyes. "May I join you?" Eleanor nodded, and Catherine came to stand beside her. For a moment, they stood in silence, watching the sun rise fully over the prairie. "It's beautiful here," Catherine said softly. "I can see why William chose it." Eleanor felt a tightness in her throat at the casual mention of his name, as if he were a shared memory rather than an absence. In a way, he was now. "He wanted space," she said. "After the war, he couldn't abide crowded places. Said he needed sky above him, not a roof." Catherine smiled slightly. Father was the same way. Couldn't stand being confined. The mention of Jonathan Winters brought Eleanor back to the practical matters at hand. "We need to check the creek today. If there is gold—" "Blackwood will be back," Catherine finished grimly, "and he won't send surveyors next time." By mid-morning, the four women made their way to the creek. The recent rain had swollen it beyond its banks, the water running swift and muddy over rocks and fallen branches. "We need to check where the water runs slowest," Eleanor explained, leading them downstream. "If there's gold, it would settle in the bends where the current weakens." They spent the morning examining the creek, looking for the telltale glint of yellow among the stones and sand. The work was wet and muddy, their skirts soon sodden and stained. Eleanor showed them how to pan for gold using a shallow tin dish from the kitchen, scooping sediment from the creek bed and swirling it carefully to separate heavier materials. By midday, they had found nothing but ordinary creek pebbles and silt. Eleanor was beginning to think Rebecca had misheard or misunderstood the conversation she'd reported. "Let's try farther downstream," she suggested, wiping sweat from her brow. The spring sun was surprisingly warm, and all four women had removed their bonnets and rolled up their sleeves. They moved to where the creek made a sharp bend before leaving Eleanor's property. Here, the water pooled deeper, creating a small, still eddy on the inner curve. Josephine, who had been quietly observant all morning, suddenly spoke up. "Mrs. Sullivan, look at the plants here." Eleanor turned to where the youngest sister was pointing. Along the bank grew a type of rush she hadn't noticed before, with distinctively pointed tips. "What about them?" she asked. "My grandmother called them gold pointers," Josephine explained. "They often grow where there are mineral deposits. The roots like the same conditions that gold does." Eleanor examined the plants with new interest. "Show me where they're thickest." Josephine led her to a spot where the rushes grew in abundance. Eleanor knelt and began to dig into the bank, with her hands scooping mud and roots aside to reach the soil beneath. Catherine joined her, using a stick to dig deeper. After several minutes of excavation, her stick struck something hard. "Rocks," she said disappointedly. "Let me see," Eleanor insisted, reaching into the hole. She pulled out a stone about the size of her palm, caked with mud. She dipped it in the creek, washing away the dirt. As the water cleared the surface, they all gasped. Embedded in the gray rock were distinct veins of yellow, small but unmistakable. "Gold," Rebecca whispered, her eyes wide. Eleanor turned the rock in her hands, examining it from all angles. "Not much in this piece, but if there's one, there could be more." She looked up at the sisters, her expression grave. "This is why Blackwood wants our land." Catherine's face hardened. "What do we do now?" Eleanor pocketed the rock and stood brushing mud from her skirt. "Now we know what we're fighting for, and we make sure our claim is ironclad." As they made their way back to the cabin, Eleanor's mind raced with plans and calculations. The gold find wasn't massive, nothing like the great strikes that had drawn thousands to California or Colorado, but even a modest deposit could be valuable. More importantly, it explained Blackwood's sudden interest in property he had ignored for years. "I need to go to town," she announced as they reached the homestead, "to check on our deed and speak with Reed." "I'll come with you," Catherine immediately volunteered. Eleanor shook her head. "No, you need to stay here with Rebecca and Josephine. Keep the rifle close and stay alert." "But we can't leave you unprotected," Catherine protested. "And I can't leave them unprotected," Eleanor said firmly. "You're the only one who can handle the rifle if needed." Catherine reluctantly agreed. Eleanor changed into her one good dress, the navy blue garment she hadn't worn since the auction, and hitched her horse to the small wagon. Before leaving, she placed the gold-bearing rock in a leather pouch and tucked it securely in her pocket. "I'll be back before dark," she promised. "If anyone comes, fire a warning shot, and they'll likely turn back. If they don't," she met Catherine's gaze steadily, "do what you must to protect yourselves." The ride to town took over an hour, the wagon wheels occasionally getting stuck in mud left by the previous night's storm. Eleanor used the time to organize her thoughts and rehearse what she would say to Reed, and if necessary to Blackwood himself. Kingston was a modest frontier town, one main street lined with wooden buildings, a few side streets with smaller establishments and homes. It had grown in the 5 years since Eleanor had first arrived with William, but it was still small enough that a woman traveling alone drew notice. She felt eyes on her as she tied her horse outside the sheriff's office. Reed looked up in surprise when she entered his office. He was alone working on paperwork at his desk, and he stood quickly when he recognized her. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said, removing his hat, though he was indoors. "This is unexpected." "I need your help, Sheriff," Eleanor said without preamble. "Blackwood sent surveyors to my property yesterday. They claim there's a question about my boundary line at the creek." Reed's expression grew serious. "I heard they were out that way. Sit down, Mrs. Sullivan." He gestured to a chair across from his desk. Eleanor remained standing. "I need to see the town's copy of my deed, and I need to know what Blackwood is planning." Reed studied her face for a moment, then nodded. "The deed copies are kept at the land office next door." He hesitated, then added, "As for Blackwood, he's been asking a lot of questions about your property and about you." "What kind of questions?" "About how you came to own the land, about your husband's military service." Reed looked uncomfortable. "About your current household arrangements." Eleanor's jaw tightened. "And what have you told him?" "As little as possible," Reed assured her, "but Blackwood has ways of getting information. He's friendly with Judge Parker, who oversees land disputes." The implication was clear. If Blackwood challenged her deed, he would have a sympathetic ear in the local judiciary. "There's something else you should know," Reed added, lowering his voice, though they were alone. "Blackwood's been bringing in men, rough types. They're staying at the saloon he owns on the edge of town." Eleanor absorbed this information, her concern deepening. Hired guns, most likely. Blackwood was preparing for something. "Thank you for the warning," she said. "Now about that deed." Reed escorted her to the land office next door, where a clerk reluctantly allowed them to examine the town's copy of the Sullivan deed. Eleanor read it carefully, confirming what she already knew. The creek ran through her property, not along its edge. The southern boundary was marked by a line of cottonwood trees nearly a quarter-mile beyond the water. "The deed is clear," she said to Reed as they left the office. "The creek is well within my property." "Deeds can be challenged," Reed said grimly, "especially when gold is involved." Eleanor stopped in her tracks. "You know about the gold?" Reed nodded slowly. "There have been rumors. Nothing confirmed, but enough to catch Blackwood's interest." "It's more than rumors," Eleanor said quietly. "We found evidence this morning." Reed's eye did widen. "That changes things. If there's proven gold on your land, Blackwood will stop at nothing to get it. Then I need to file a mineral claim." Eleanor decided to strengthen my position. "The claims office is at the courthouse," Reed said. "But Mrs. Sullivan, I must caution you. Making an official claim will only confirm what Blackwood suspects. It might accelerate his plans." "Better to secure my legal position than hope he gives up," Eleanor replied firmly. "Will you come with me to file the claim?" Reed hesitated, then nodded. "I'll help you, but there's something I need to tell you first." He glanced around the busy street. "Not here. Let's speak in my office." Back in the privacy of the sheriff's office, Reed seemed uncharacteristically nervous. He paced behind his desk, removing his hat and running a hand through his hair. "Mrs. Sullivan, Eleanor," he began, using her first name for the first time. What I'm about to tell you may come as a shock. Eleanor tensed, preparing herself for bad news about Blackwood or the legal status of her land. My full name is Nathaniel Reed Sullivan, he said quietly. I'm William's brother. Eleanor stared at him, uncomprehending. That's not possible. William was an only child. Reed shook his head. Half-brother, different mothers. My mother was Jonathan Winter's first wife's sister, his sister-in-law. There was an indiscretion after William's mother died. Jonathan married Elizabeth quickly to cover the scandal, but I was born just 7 months after the wedding. Eleanor sank into the chair she had earlier refused, her mind reeling from the second familial revelation in less than a day. William never mentioned you, she said weakly. He didn't know about me until we met during the war. I was a private in his unit. Reed smiled sadly. The resemblance was noticed by others before we realized it ourselves. When we compared stories, we discovered the truth. Why didn't he tell me? Eleanor asked, feeling a stab of betrayal that William had kept such a secret. He wanted to after the war, Reed assured her. He wrote to me about you, often said you were the best person he had ever known, that you'd understand and welcome me as family. But then, Eleanor began. Then he died, Reed finished hollowly. I was stationed in Missouri when I got word. By the time I could get away, he was already gone. I didn't know how to approach you in your grief, claiming to be family you'd never heard of. So you became the sheriff here, watching over me from a distance. Eleanor wasn't sure whether to feel comforted or manipulated by this revelation. I promised William I'd look out for you if anything happened to him, Reed said simply. Being sheriff was the best way to do that without intruding on your life. Eleanor studied his face with new awareness. Now that she knew to look, she could see traces of William in his features, the shape of his brow, the set of his jaw. Why tell me now, she asked. Because you're in danger, Reed said gravely. Real danger. And because I've seen a change in you these past weeks. Since those women came to your farm, you have come back to life. William would be glad of that. Eleanor took a deep breath, trying to process everything. Those women, the sisters I bought at auction, they're also William's family. His half-sisters from his father's second marriage. Reed's eyes widened in genuine shock. That can't be coincidence. No, Eleanor agreed. It seems William had more family than either of us knew. She stood, feeling suddenly resolute. Which gives me even more reason to protect what's ours. What do you intend to do? Reed asked. First file that mineral claim, Eleanor said firmly, then prepare for whatever Blackwood has planned. She looked Reed directly in the eyes. Will you help us as family? Reed straightened his expression, solemn. I've been helping from the shadows for 5 years, Eleanor. It's time I did so openly. Together they walked to the courthouse to file Eleanor's mineral claim on the gold found in her creek. As she signed the papers, Eleanor felt a strange sense of things coming full circle. 5 years ago, she had been half alive, a shell of grief preserving the memory of a dead man. Now she was fighting for a future, not just for herself, but for the family William had never known he had. As they left the courthouse, Eleanor caught sight of a familiar figure across the street. Colonel Blackwood stood outside his bank, deep in conversation with the 2 surveyors who had visited her property. He looked up as if sensing her gaze, his eyes narrowing when he saw her with Reed. Eleanor didn't look away. She met his stare, directly refusing to show fear. After a moment, it was Blackwood who broke the contact, turning back to his conversation with a dismissive gesture. He knows we're making moves, Reed said quietly. Good, Eleanor replied. Let him know we're not helpless women he can intimidate. As they walked back to her wagon, Eleanor felt the weight of the gold-bearing rock in her pocket. It represented both danger and opportunity, a threat to her family's safety, but also a chance for a new beginning. Come out to the farm tonight, she told Reed. Meet your nieces properly. We need to make plans. Reed nodded, his expression grave but determined. I'll be there after sundown. Eleanor climbed into her wagon, her mind already racing ahead to the confrontation she knew was coming. Blackwood would make his move soon, now that she had filed a mineral claim. But he would find that the widow Sullivan and her newfound family were not the easy targets he imagined. This time, Eleanor had something worth fighting for. Not just land or gold, but the future William would have wanted for them all. As she drove the wagon out of town, Eleanor caught a final glimpse of Blackwood watching her departure. She straightened her back and held her head high, channeling the strength she had once shown on blood-soaked battlefields. The war might have ended years ago, but for Eleanor Sullivan, A new battle was just beginning. Twilight settled over the Nebraska plains like a prayer painting the endless sky in watercolor strokes of indigo and gold. Eleanor stood on her porch watching the horizon where the sun had just disappeared. In the distance, a lone rider approached, silhouetted against the fading light. Reed. Behind her, the cabin hummed with quiet activity. Catherine moved around the table, setting out plates for supper. Rebecca stirred a pot of stew that filled the air with savory aromas. Josephine arranged freshly picked wildflowers in a jar, a small touch of beauty that would have seemed frivolous to Eleanor just weeks ago. It was strange how quickly the rhythms of her life had changed, how swiftly solitude had given way to family. For 5 years, she had lived in suspended animation, her existence a monument to what she had lost. Now suddenly the homestead breathed with life again, but that life was in danger. "He's coming," Eleanor called over her shoulder, not taking her eyes off the approaching rider. Catherine joined her on the porch, William's rifle cradled in her arms. Her pregnancy was now pronounced enough to make the weapon look incongruous against her rounded form. Yet she held it with the confidence of someone who had practiced daily. "Just one rider?" she asked, her voice tense. "It's Reed," Eleanor assured her. "But stay alert. Blackwood could have men watching." The sisters had taken the news about Reed with surprising equanimity. Perhaps after discovering they were William's half-sisters, learning about another hidden sibling seemed less shocking. Or perhaps they had simply grown accustomed to life's unpredictable turns. Reed dismounted as he reached the yard, leading his horse the final few yards. Even in the fading light, Eleanor could see the worry etched on his features. "Any trouble on the road?" she asked as he approached. Reed shook his head. "None that I could see, but that doesn't mean we're not being watched." He removed his hat as he stepped onto the porch. "Evening, Catherine." Catherine nodded in greeting, studying his face with new awareness. "You have his eyes too," she observed. "Different color, but the same shape." A ghost of a smile crossed Reed's face. "William always said our eyes gave away the connection." He turned to Eleanor. "May I come in? We have much to discuss." Inside, Reed was introduced properly to Rebecca and Josephine. The younger sisters regarded this newfound uncle with cautious curiosity. But as they sat down to supper, the awkwardness gradually eased. Reed spoke of William with genuine affection, sharing stories from their time together during the war that Eleanor had never heard. "He carried your picture everywhere," Reed told Eleanor. "Showed it to anyone who would look. Said you were the strongest person he'd ever known, that you could stitch a man back together while shells were falling all around." Eleanor felt a sharp pang of memory. "He exaggerated. I was just doing my job." "He didn't exaggerate about your courage," Reed said. "And I think you're going to need it again." His expression turned serious. "Blackwood's making moves faster than I expected. After you left town today, he filed a formal challenge to your property boundary." Eleanor's hand tightened around her fork. "On what grounds?" "He claims to have found an earlier survey that places the creek as the boundary line, not the cottonwoods." Reed shook his head in disgust. "It's fabricated, of course, but Judge Parker has agreed to hear the case." "When?" Catherine asked sharply. "2 weeks from now." Reed looked grim. "But I don't think Blackwood plans to wait for legal proceedings. The men he's brought in aren't the type to respect the law." "How many?" Eleanor asked. "At least 6 that I've seen. Hard cases, all of them." The sisters exchanged worried glances. Rebecca's face had gone pale, her hand unconsciously moving to her belly as if to protect the child within. "What do we do?" Josephine asked, her young voice steady despite the fear evident in her eyes. Eleanor considered their options. They could have mended the homestead, flee to another territory where Blackwood couldn't reach them. But that would mean surrendering not just the land and the gold, but everything William had built. Everything he had left for his family, the family he hadn't even known existed. "We stay," she said firmly. "We fight. Against 6 armed men." Rebecca questioned, her voice barely above a whisper. 7 counting Blackwood, Reed corrected grimly. "And 4 of us," Catherine countered, straightening her shoulders. 5 with the sheriff." Reed shifted uncomfortably. "My position complicates things. As sheriff, I'm sworn to uphold the law, even unjust laws." "If Blackwood secures that court ruling," Eleanor began, "then we need to make our stand before the court date," Catherine concluded. Eleanor turned to Reed. "How soon do you think they'll move against us?" "Soon, perhaps within days." Reed leaned forward. "Blackwood was furious when he learned you'd filed a mineral claim. He knows you found gold." The reality of their situation settled over the table like a shroud. 4 women, 3 of them pregnant, and 1 lawman against Blackwood and his hired guns. The odds were not in their favor. But Eleanor had faced terrible odds before on battlefields, where men died by the hundreds, and her hands had been the only thing standing between wounded soldiers and eternity. "We need to prepare," she said, her nurse's mind already cataloging what they would require: supplies, ammunition, medical necessities. She looked at each of the sisters in turn. "And we need to make this place defensible." Reed nodded his agreement. "I can bring supplies tomorrow, ammunition, extra weapons. But Eleanor, you should consider sending the sisters away somewhere safe." "No," Catherine said immediately. "We stay together." Rebecca and Josephine nodded their assent, though fears still shadowed their eyes. "We're family," Josephine said simply. "All of us." Eleanor felt something warm unfurl in her chest at those words. Family. For so long, she had been alone, her only connection to the world severed when William died. Now suddenly she had people to protect, people who were willing to stand with her. "Then we all stay," she decided. "But we'll be smart about this. Reed, what else can you tell us about Blackwood's men?" As Reed described the hired guns, their habits, their weapons, their apparent experience, Eleanor began formulating a plan. By the time the meal ended and the lamps burned low, they had outlined a strategy for defending the homestead. Reed would return the following day with supplies. They would fortify the cabin and barn, creating defensive positions and escape routes if needed. Catherine would continue practicing with the rifle. Rebecca and Josephine would prepare medical supplies and food that could sustain them through a siege. "I should go," Reed said, finally rising from the table. "If I'm gone too long, it might raise suspicions." Eleanor walked him to the door. Outside, the Nebraska night was clear and cold stars scattered across the vast darkness like diamond dust. "Be careful," Eleanor warned, "and Blackwood may be watching you too now that he's seen us together." Reed settled his hat on his head. "I can handle myself." He hesitated, then added softly, "William would be proud of you, Eleanor, of how you've protected his family." Eleanor felt her throat tighten. "I didn't know I was protecting his family when I bought the sisters. You just couldn't stand by and let innocent people suffer." Reed finished for her. "That's who you are. That's who you've always been, even when grief clouded everything else." After Reed departed, Eleanor returned to find the sisters clearing the table. Their movements were efficient despite their advancing pregnancies. They had adapted to life on the homestead with remarkable resilience, these city girls who had known nothing of farming or frontier life before their arrival. "We should get some rest," Eleanor told them. "Tomorrow will be a long day." As she prepared for bed, Eleanor found herself opening William's journal again. She turned to an entry she had read countless times. April 10, 1865. "The war is ending. Word came today of Lee's surrender. The men are celebrating, but I find myself thinking only of home, of Eleanor, and the life we will build together." She speaks of Nebraska, of open skies and fresh beginnings. Perhaps that is what we all need after so much death. Reed agrees. He may join us out west once his service concludes. "I look forward to introducing him to Eleanor properly, to creating the family connections I've always longed for. I dream of children, of a home filled with laughter instead of screams of growing old, beside the woman who saved me in more ways than she knows." Eleanor closed the journal, her fingers lingering on the leather cover. William had wanted family, had dreamed of children. Now, in a twist of fate too strange to be coincidence, his family had found her instead, had brought life back to the home that had fallen silent with his death. She would not lose them now. Dawn brought a flurry of activity to the homestead. Eleanor woke the sisters early, assigning tasks with the efficiency she had once employed in field hospitals. "Catherine, check our ammunition supplies and clean all the weapons. Rebecca, we need bandages, tear any spare cloth into strips. Josephine, gather all your medicinal herbs and prepare as many remedies as possible." Eleanor herself inspected the cabin and outbuildings with a tactical eye she hadn't used since the war. The cabin's thick log walls would provide good protection from bullets. The root cellar beneath the floor could serve as a shelter for Rebecca and Josephine if fighting broke out. The barn offered additional defensive positions, with its hayloft providing an elevated vantage point. By mid-morning, Reed arrived with a wagon load of supplies, ammunition, extra weapons, food staples, and medical necessities. He brought news as well, none of it good. Blackwood's men were drinking heavily at the saloon last night, he reported as they unloaded the wagon, talking about claiming gold and teaching women their place. I tried to caution them about respecting property rights, but they just laughed. When will they come? Eleanor asked, securing a box of ammunition in the cabin. Soon. Today, perhaps, or tomorrow. Reed looked troubled. I can't stay, Eleanor. If I'm missing from town when they make their move, Blackwood will know I've warned you. Eleanor nodded her understanding. We'll manage. I'll try to delay them, create some distraction in town to buy you time. Reed handed her a folded paper. This is a telegram I sent to the territorial governor reporting Blackwood's intimidation tactics and the suspicious nature of his claim. It may not help immediately, but it establishes a record. Thank you, Eleanor said, tucking the paper into her pocket. Before Reed departed, he spent an hour with Catherine showing her additional shooting techniques, how to lead a moving target, how to conserve ammunition, how to shoot from cover. He spoke briefly with Rebecca and Josephine as well, offering encouragement and practical advice for what might come. When he finally mounted his horse to leave, he turned to Eleanor one last time. If things go badly, there's a cavalry outpost 40 miles east. They might respond to reports of armed violence against civilians. Let's hope it doesn't come to that, Eleanor replied. The rest of the day passed in tense preparation. Eleanor found herself falling back on skills honed during the war, assessing resources, preparing for casualties, establishing clear protocols for different scenarios. By evening, they were as ready as they could be. The cabin had been fortified with furniture positioned to provide cover. Buckets of water stood ready to douse fires. Weapons and ammunition were distributed strategically throughout the homestead. As darkness fell, Eleanor gathered the sisters in the cabin. Outside, a spring storm was brewing, thunder rumbling in the distance. It reminded her of artillery fire, a sound she had hoped never to associate with home. Try to rest, she told the sisters. Sleep in shifts. 2 awake, 2 asleep. Rebecca, who had been quiet most of the day, suddenly spoke up. If they come, if Blackwood comes, she swallowed hard. He won't show mercy. Neither will we, Catherine said firmly, checking William's rifle one more time. Eleanor looked at each of them in turn, Catherine with her determined jaw and William's blue eyes, Rebecca with her fragile exterior that masked unexpected strength, Josephine with her quiet wisdom beyond her years. In just a few weeks, they had become more than charges under her protection. They had become family. Whatever happens, Eleanor said, we face it together. The storm arrived with full force an hour later, rain lashing against the windows and thunder shaking the cabin's sturdy frame. Eleanor took the first watch with Catherine while Rebecca and Josephine tried to sleep behind the curtained area. They sat in silence by the fire listening to the storm's fury. Eleanor found herself remembering another night of thunder years ago when she and William had huddled together in a field hospital as artillery fire rained around them. He had held her hand, then his touch, an anchor in the chaos. He would have loved you, Eleanor said suddenly, looking at Catherine's profile in the firelight. William, I mean, he always wanted siblings. Catherine smiled faintly. I used to imagine meeting him. In my mind, he was larger than life, the brave Union officer fighting for justice. He was just a man, Eleanor said softly. A good man, but human like the rest of us. Afraid sometimes, uncertain. But he always tried to do what was right, even when it cost him. Like testifying against Blackwood, Catherine observed. Eleanor nodded. That was William. He couldn't abide cruelty or injustice, no matter the personal risk. They fell silent again, each lost in thoughts of the man who connected them. Outside, the storm began to subside, the thunder growing more distant, the rain softening to a gentle patter. It was in that quieter moment that they heard it, the unmistakable sound of horses approaching. Not from the direction of town, but from the south, from the creek. Eleanor was on her feet instantly. Wake Rebecca and Josephine, she ordered in a hushed voice, reaching for the revolver she kept nearby. Get them to the root cellar. Catherine moved swiftly, rousing her sisters, while Eleanor peered cautiously through a window. In the dim moonlight, now breaking through the clouds, she could make out several riders approaching from the direction of the creek. How many? Catherine asked, returning to Eleanor's side with the rifle. At least 4, maybe more, Eleanor replied. They're trying to stay hidden using the trees as cover. Rebecca and Josephine emerged from behind the curtain, their faces pale with fear, but composed. Get to the root cellar, Eleanor instructed them. Take water bandages and a weapon. Stay quiet no matter what you hear. Rebecca hesitated. What about you and Catherine? We'll handle this, Eleanor said with more confidence than she felt. Go now quickly. As the younger sisters disappeared through the trap door to the root cellar beneath the cabin floor, Eleanor turned to Catherine. Remember what Reed taught you. Don't fire unless you have a clear shot. Make every bullet count. Catherine nodded grimly, taking up position at one window while Eleanor covered another. They dimmed the lamps, leaving only the faint glow of the dying fire to illuminate the cabin's interior. Outside, the riders had stopped at the edge of the clearing. Eleanor counted 6 men, their figures occasionally illuminated by the fitful moonlight breaking through the departing storm clouds. They appeared to be conferring, gesturing toward the cabin and the barn. Blackwood isn't with them, Catherine whispered. He wouldn't dirty his hands directly, Eleanor replied. These are his hired guns. One of the men separated from the group, approaching the cabin with exaggerated caution. When he was about 30 yards away, he called out, his voice carrying clearly in the post-storm stillness. Hello, the house. Anyone awake in there? Eleanor and Catherine remained silent, watching. We know you're in there, Mrs. Sullivan, the man continued. We just want to talk about that creek property. Colonel Blackwood sent us with a generous offer. Still, they did not respond. The man turned back toward his companions, shrugging. At some signal, Eleanor couldn't see the men suddenly spread out, 2 heading toward the barn, while the others approached the cabin from different directions. They're surrounding us, Catherine said tensely. Eleanor made a swift decision. Fire a warning shot, over their heads. Catherine raised the rifle, took careful aim through the window, and squeezed the trigger. The shot cracked through the night air, causing the approaching men to dive for cover. That's your only warning, Eleanor called out. This is private property. Leave now. There was a moment of silence, then a burst of mocking laughter from the darkness. 2 women against 6 men, a different voice called back. Bad odds, ladies. We're taking that Gold Creek one way or another. Makes it easier for everyone if you just sign the papers. There are no papers that will make me sign away what's mine, Eleanor responded. Leave now or face the consequences. The only answer was a shot that splintered the window frame inches from her head. Eleanor ducked as glass shattered inward, then returned fire with her revolver, aiming at a muzzle flash she'd spotted near the woodpile. A cry of pain told her she'd hit something or someone. The night erupted into chaos. Shots came from multiple directions, bullets thudding into the cabin's log walls or whistling through windows. Eleanor and Catherine returned fire, methodically moving from window to window to give the impression of more defenders. They're trying to reach the porch, Catherine warned, firing at a shadow that darted between trees. Eleanor saw another figure making a run for the barn. She fired twice, missing with the first shot but hitting him with the second. The man stumbled but kept going, disappearing into the barn's shadowed interior. They'll try to set fire to the cabin, Eleanor predicted, reloading her revolver with practiced movements. We need to keep them away from the walls. For what seemed like hours but was probably only minutes, they maintained their defense, firing only when they had clear targets, making each shot count as Reed had instructed. 2 of the attackers were definitely wounded. Eleanor had heard their cries and seen one being dragged to cover by his companions. But the remaining men were adapting, using the outbuildings and trees for cover as they worked their way closer to the cabin. And Eleanor knew their ammunition wouldn't last forever. A new sound caught her attention, breaking glass, followed by the unmistakable whoosh of flames igniting. Through the window, she saw fire blooming along the side of the barn. They're burning us out, Catherine gasped, her face illuminated by the growing blaze. Eleanor calculated quickly. The barn was far enough from the cabin that the fire wouldn't spread immediately, but it created a new problem. The light from the flames would expose anyone trying to move between buildings, eliminating the cover of darkness they had relied on. We need to, she began, but was interrupted by a sound from the back of the cabin, the scrape of a boot on the porch steps. Eleanor whirled, raising her revolver just as the back door splintered inward. A large man burst through, gun drawn. Catherine fired without hesitation, the rifle's report deafening in the confined space. The intruder staggered but didn't fall, returning fire as he lunged forward. Eleanor felt a searing pain across her upper arm as a bullet grazed her, but she maintained her aim and fired twice. The man finally collapsed, his weapon clattering to the floor. Behind you, Catherine shouted. Eleanor turned to see another attacker at the front window, taking aim at Catherine. She fired her last two bullets in rapid succession. The man jerked backward and disappeared from view. "Are you hit?" Catherine asked urgently, moving to Eleanor's window. "Just grazed," Eleanor replied, pressing a hand to her bleeding arm. "How many bullets do you have left?" "3 in the rifle, maybe 10 for the revolver." Catherine looked grim. "Not enough." Outside the barn was fully engulfed now, flames reaching toward the sky and casting a hellish glow over the homestead. In that light, Eleanor could see at least 3 men still active, using the distraction of the fire to work their way closer to the cabin. "We need to get to the root cellar," she decided. "Barricade ourselves in with Rebecca and Josephine." As they prepared to retreat, a new sound reached them, horses approaching at a gallop, not from the direction of the attackers, but from the road. "Multiple riders moving fast," Catherine said despairingly. "They've brought more men." Eleanor moved to the window, peering cautiously through the broken glass. In the firelight, she could make out several riders emerging from the darkness. But something about their approach was different, more organized, more disciplined than Blackwood's hired guns. A commanding voice rang out. "This is Sheriff Reed. Drop your weapons." Relief flooded through Eleanor. Reed had come, and he wasn't alone. She counted at least 4 other riders with him, all armed. "Sheriff," one of Blackwood's men called back, "this ain't your business. We're just settling a property dispute for the colonel." "With guns and fire." Reed's voice was cold. "Drop your weapons now, or I'll consider you an armed rebellion against the law." The night dissolved into confused shouting and sporadic gunfire. 2 of Blackwood's men tried to flee toward the creek, but were cut off by Reed's deputies. Another surrendered immediately, throwing down his weapon and raising his hands. One man made a desperate dash for the trees, firing wildly as he ran. Multiple shots answered him, and he fell face down in the mud, motionless. In less than 5 minutes, it was over. Reed and his men had subdued or killed all of Blackwood's hired guns. As silence fell once more over the homestead, broken only by the crackling of the burning barn, Eleanor opened the cabin door. "Eleanor," Reed called, dismounting and rushing toward her. "Are you hurt?" "Just a graze," she replied, indicating her bloodied sleeve. "Catherine's unhurt. Rebecca and Josephine are in the root cellar." Reed looked relieved. "Thank God. When I heard Blackwood's men had ridden out, I gathered every trustworthy man I could find and followed." He glanced at the burning barn. "I'm sorry we couldn't get here sooner." "You came when it mattered," Eleanor said simply. As Reed's men secured the surviving attackers, Catherine helped Rebecca and Josephine from the root cellar. The younger sisters were shaken but unharmed, clinging to each other as they emerged into the firelit night. "It's over," Catherine assured them. "We're safe." But Eleanor knew better. "Not yet," she said, looking at Reed. "Blackwood is still out there, and he'll be desperate now." Reed nodded grimly. "We should get you all to town where I can protect you properly." Eleanor was about to agree when a rider appeared at the edge of the property, a solitary figure silhouetted against the night sky. Even at a distance, she recognized the straight-back posture and distinctive hat. Blackwood. He remained motionless for a long moment, surveying the scene, his defeated men, the burning barn, Reed and his deputies. Then, without a word, he wheeled his horse and galloped away into the darkness. "Let him go," Reed said, placing a restraining hand on Eleanor's arm as she instinctively moved forward. "We'll deal with him properly through the law." Eleanor wasn't convinced, but she nodded. The immediate danger had passed, and her arm was beginning to throb painfully where the bullet had grazed it. "Come inside," she said wearily. "All of you. We need to tend wounds and decide what to do next." Dawn revealed the full extent of the night's violence. The barn was a smoldering ruin, black smoke still rising from its charred skeleton. Bullet holes pocked the cabin's exterior. 2 of Blackwood's men lay dead, covered with canvas sheets, until they could be properly transported to town. 3 others were wounded but alive, under guard by Reed's deputies. Eleanor had treated all the injured friend and foe alike, her nurse's training overriding any impulse toward vengeance. Her own wound had been cleaned and bandaged by Josephine, whose herbal poultice had eased the burning pain. Reed had sent one of his men to town with news of the attack and instructions to watch for Blackwood, who had not been seen since his brief appearance the night before. "What happens now?" Catherine asked as they sat around the table, exhaustion evident in every face. "We go to town," Reed replied. "All of you. It's not safe here. Not while Blackwood is free." Eleanor knew he was right, but the thought of abandoning the homestead even temporarily filled her with reluctance. This land was all she had left of William, the future he had planned for them. The hearing about the property boundary is still scheduled for next week, Reed continued, with evidence of Blackwood's violent attempt to seize the land, plus the gold discovery. I believe the judge will rule in your favor. Even Parker, corrupt as he is, can't ignore such blatant criminal activity. And if he doesn't, Josephine asked softly. Reed's expression hardened. Then we appeal to the territorial governor. I've already sent telegrams about the situation. They spent the morning salvaging what they could from the damaged homestead. The cabin itself was structurally sound despite the bullet holes and broken windows. The barn was a total loss, but the chicken coop and smokehouse had survived unscathed. By noon, they were ready to depart. Eleanor took one last walk around the property while Reed and his men prepared the wagons. She found herself drawn to the creek, the source of both their trouble and their potential prosperity. The water flowed clear and cool over smooth stones, giving no indication of the gold that lay hidden in its banks. Eleanor knelt and dipped her hand into the current, letting the water slip through her fingers like time itself. Mrs. Sullivan, she turned to find Rebecca standing a few yards away, her expression hesitant. Yes, Rebecca. I just wanted to thank you, the young woman said, her voice stronger than it had been when she first arrived at the homestead. Not just for saving us at the auction, but for teaching us to be strong. Eleanor looked at her with surprise. I didn't teach you that. You were already strong. You just needed to remember it. Rebecca shook her head. Before we came here, I thought I was broken. What happened to me at Blackwood's place? I thought it had destroyed something inside me that couldn't be fixed. She rested a hand on her swollen belly. But watching you, learning from you, it helped me see that we can survive terrible things and still have a future. Eleanor felt unexpected tears prick her eyes. We all have a future now, she said softly. Together. When they returned to the cabin, Reed was helping Catherine and Josephine into the wagon. The wounded prisoners had already been loaded into a second wagon under guard. Ready, Reed asked as Eleanor approached. She took one last look at the homestead, at the life she had built with William, at the solitary existence she had maintained after his death, at the unexpected family she had found in his absence. Yes, she said, I'm ready. The journey to town passed uneventfully, though Reed kept his men alert for any sign of Blackwood. They arrived in Kingston by late afternoon, drawing curious stares from townsfolk as they made their way to the jail. Reed had arranged rooms for the women at the small hotel, deeming it safer than his own modest quarters behind the sheriff's office. As they settled in, Eleanor found herself thinking of the last time she had stayed in town, the night before she and William had left for their homestead, full of hopes for their future. Now she was back, a different woman, with a different family, facing an uncertain tomorrow. The following day brought news Blackwood had been seen boarding the eastbound train, apparently fleeing the territory. Reed was skeptical. It's too convenient, he said when he visited them at the hotel. Blackwood isn't the type to surrender so easily. His suspicion proved correct. That evening, as Eleanor sat with the sisters in their hotel room discussing plans for rebuilding the barn, a commotion erupted in the street below. Catherine moved to the window, peering cautiously through the curtains. It's Blackwood, she reported tensely, with Judge Parker and several other men. They're going into the sheriff's office. Eleanor joined her at the window, watching as the distinguished figures disappeared into the building across the street. He's making his move legally this time. What can he do? Josephine asked worriedly. With Parker's help, issue warrants, make false claims, twist the law to his advantage. Eleanor's mind raced. We need to get to Reed. But before they could act, another sound rose from the street, hoofbeats, many of them approaching rapidly from the east. A column of uniformed cavalry soldiers rode into view, led by an officer whose bearing suggested authority. The cavalry, Rebecca breathed. Reed's telegram worked. They watched as the officer dismounted outside the sheriff's office, followed by several of his men. The rest of the troop remained on horseback, their presence bringing a sudden hush to the previously bustling street. We should go down, Eleanor decided. See what's happening. They made their way to the hotel lobby just as Reed burst through the front door, his expression a mixture of relief and urgency. Eleanor, thank God you're here. Come quickly, all of you. What's happening? Catherine demanded as they followed him outside. Captain James Morrison from Fort Kearney, Reed explained hurriedly. He's responding to my telegram about armed violence against civilians, and he's brought something else, documentation about Blackwood's war crimes. Eleanor's heart quickened. William's testimony. Reed nodded. Apparently it was filed but never acted upon. Until now. Morrison served under the same commander as William. When he received my telegram with Blackwood's name, he connected the dots and brought the file. They entered the sheriff's office to find a tense standoff in progress. Captain Morrison, a stern-faced man in his 40s, stood facing Blackwood and Judge Parker. Several cavalry soldiers flanked their captain while Blackwood's few remaining supporters clustered nervously to one side. Mrs. Sullivan, Captain Morrison said as they entered, your reputation precedes you. Your husband served honorably under Colonel Harris, as did I. Thank you, Captain, Eleanor replied, acutely aware of Blackwood's glare. I understand you've brought information about Colonel Blackwood. Indeed. Morrison tapped a file on Reed's desk. Documentation of war crimes committed during the conflict, specifically the torture and execution of Union prisoners in 1863. Lieutenant William Sullivan was a key witness, though the case was apparently set aside after the war. Judge Parker, a florid man with an impressive beard, shifted uncomfortably. That's all very interesting, Captain, but it has no bearing on the current property dispute between Colonel Blackwood and Mrs. Sullivan. On the contrary, Reed interjected, it establishes a pattern of criminal behavior and a motive for targeting Mrs. Sullivan, specifically revenge against her husband. Blackwood's composed facade finally cracked. This is absurd, he spat. Ancient history being dredged up to distract from the real issue, trespassing and theft of mineral rights. Theft, Eleanor stepped forward facing Blackwood directly. The creek runs through my property. The gold within it is mine by law. Your property line is in dispute, Blackwood countered. A dispute you manufactured, Reed said firmly. We have testimony from your hired men that you ordered them to seize the land by force knowing your legal claim was fraudulent. Captain Morrison cleared his throat. Judge Parker, I have orders to investigate reports of armed violence against civilians in this territory. Based on the evidence I've seen, including the sworn statements from Sheriff Reed, and these prisoners, Colonel Blackwood appears to have organized what amounts to an armed insurrection. Parker's face had grown increasingly pale during this exchange. That's a serious accusation, Captain. Indeed it is, Morrison agreed. One that would typically be tried in a military court given Blackwood's former rank in the nature of the crimes. This was clearly news to Parker, whose allegiance to Blackwood visibly wavered. Blackwood himself seemed to shrink, his commanding presence diminished by the turning tide. He looked at Eleanor with naked hatred. This isn't over, he said, his voice low and dangerous. Yes, Colonel, she replied stoically. It is. At a nod from Morrison, two soldiers stepped forward to take Blackwood into custody. The once powerful man offered no resistance, though his eyes promised retribution until the last moment before he was led away. Judge Parker, suddenly eager to distance himself from his former ally, assured Reed and Captain Morrison that he would dismiss any challenges to Eleanor's property deed immediately. As the impromptu hearing concluded, Eleanor found herself surrounded by her newfound family, Catherine, Rebecca, and Josephine on one side, Reed on the other. Together they had faced down a man who had once commanded fear and respect throughout the region. It's really over, Josephine said wonderingly as they stepped back into the street. Eleanor nodded, though she knew the road ahead would not be easy. The barn needed rebuilding, the gold in the creek would require proper mining, and soon, very soon, 3 new lives would enter the world. William's nieces or nephews' children who would never know him, but would grow up hearing stories of his courage. What now? Rebecca asked unconsciously, echoing Eleanor's thoughts. Eleanor looked at each of them in turn, these women who had arrived as strangers and become family, this man who had watched over her from afar, honoring a promise to his brother. Now she said, we go home. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of activity. With Blackwood in custody awaiting trial for multiple charges, Eleanor and the sisters returned to the homestead. Reed arranged for men from town to help clear the ruins of the old barn and begin construction on a new one. The story of Blackwood's attack and subsequent arrest had spread throughout the territory, transforming Eleanor from a pitied widow to a respected figure in the community. People who had once avoided her now greeted her warmly in town, offering assistance with rebuilding or expressing admiration for her courage. Most surprising was the change in Eleanor herself. The grief that had defined her for 5 years hadn't disappeared, but it had shifted, making room for other emotions: determination, purpose, even occasional joy. She found herself smiling at Rebecca's singing as they worked, laughing at Josephine's folk remedies for pregnancy discomforts, admiring Catherine's growing skill with the rifle. One evening, as the four women sat on the porch watching the sunset, a wagon approached from town. Eleanor recognized the driver as Jacob Miller, the local minister, a kindly man who had always been respectful, but distant. Beside him sat Edith Cooper, the widow who ran the general store. "Mrs. Sullivan," Miller called as he drew the wagon to a stop. "We hope we're not intruding." "Not at all," Eleanor replied, curious about this unexpected visit. Miller and Mrs. Cooper climbed down the ladder carrying a large basket covered with a cloth. "The ladies of the church society wanted to bring you these," Miss Cooper said, presenting the basket to Eleanor. "Just some preserves and baked goods, a small token of our support." Eleanor accepted the basket, touched by the gesture. "That's very kind. Won't you come in?" Over coffee and Mrs. Cooper's own apple cake, their visitors explained the real purpose of their visit. "The town council met yesterday," Miller said. "In light of recent events and with Captain Morrison's recommendation, they've decided to offer you a formal apology for not intervening sooner in Blackwood's activities." Eleanor was stunned. "An apology?" "Many of us knew what kind of man he was," Mrs. Cooper admitted, her weathered face somber. "But we were afraid. He had money influence. Even those who didn't like him felt they needed his business." "The council has also voted to assist with rebuilding your barn," Miller added. "And there's talk of establishing a proper mining operation at the creek with you as the primary shareholder, of course." Eleanor glanced at Catherine, who nodded slightly, encouraging her to accept this olive branch. "I appreciate the town's generosity," Eleanor said carefully, "and I accept your apology, but I want you to know that my family and I can manage on our own if need be." "Of course," Miller said quickly. "We don't mean to impose, only to make amends. And perhaps to get to know you better," Mrs. Cooper added with a warm smile at the sisters. "All of you. It's not often we get new faces in Kingston, especially not such interesting ones." By the time Miller and Mrs. Cooper departed, plans had been made for Sunday services, the first Eleanor would attend since William's funeral, and for a community barn raising the following week. "Things are changing," Catherine observed as they watched the wagon disappear down the road. "Yes," Eleanor agreed. "For the better, I think." Reed visited often in the following days, bringing news from town and spending time with his newly discovered nieces. Eleanor noticed the way his gaze lingered on Catherine, the softening of his voice when he spoke to her. It was clear his interest went beyond familial concern, though he maintained a respectful distance given her condition. One afternoon, as Reed helped Eleanor repair the cabin's broken windows, he broached a subject that had clearly been on his mind. "I've been thinking about my position as sheriff," he said, carefully fitting a pane of glass into its frame. "After everything that's happened, I'm not sure I'm the right man for the job anymore." "What do you mean?" Eleanor asked, handing him a nail. "I compromised," Reed said grimly. "For years I knew what Blackwood was, but I worked around him, tried to minimize the damage rather than confronting him directly. If I'd acted sooner, then you might be dead," Eleanor said bluntly, "and we would have faced Blackwood alone." Reed's hand stilled on the window frame. "Maybe, but I keep thinking about William, what he would have done. He never compromised on what was right, even when it cost him." "William had his own struggles," Eleanor said softly. "His own regrets. He wasn't perfect, Reed. None of us are." Reed seemed to consider this. "I've been offered a position with the Territorial Marshal's office," he said finally. "It would mean traveling, enforcing federal law, rather than local ordinances. I'd have more authority to handle men like Blackwood." "You'd be good at it," Eleanor said, feeling a pang at the thought of him leaving. "But what about Kingston? Who would be sheriff?" Reed smiled slightly. "I've recommended Deputy Collins. He's young but solid, and he stood with us against Blackwood when it mattered." Eleanor nodded, accepting his decision. "When would you go?" "Not until after." Reed's gaze drifted toward the cabin where Catherine could be seen through the window kneading bread dough. "Not until I know you're all settled and safe." Eleanor recognized the unspoken sentiment in his words. "Catherine will need time," she said gently, "after the baby comes, after everything she's been through." "I know," Reed replied. "I can wait." 3 days later, as the first walls of the new barn rose against the Nebraska sky, Rebecca's labor began. It came on suddenly, her water breaking as she hung laundry on the line. Eleanor had prepared for this moment, reviewing her medical texts and organizing Josephine's herbs, but the reality of bringing a new life into the world after so much death still filled her with trepidation. She sent Catherine for clean water and linens, positioned Josephine as her assistant, and helped Rebecca to the bed that had been prepared in the main room of the cabin. The younger woman's face was pale with fear, her hands clutching Eleanor's with desperate strength. "I can't do this," she whispered. "I'm not ready." Eleanor squeezed her hands reassuringly. "You can and you will. I'll be with you every step." The labor was long and difficult. Rebecca's slender frame struggled with the pain, her cries piercing the cabin as contractions intensified. Catherine paced anxiously outside, unable to bear her sister's suffering, but unwilling to leave. Josephine remained steadfast, applying herbal compresses and offering sips of a calming tea between contractions. As twilight descended, Reed arrived with the town doctor, an elderly man named Harrison, whom Eleanor had met only briefly. He offered his assistance, but seeing Eleanor's capable management and Josephine's effective remedies, he mostly observed, occasionally offering advice or encouragement. "You have a healer's touch, Mrs. Sullivan," he remarked as Eleanor coached Rebecca through a particularly difficult contraction. "We could use skills like yours in town." Eleanor didn't respond, her focus entirely on Rebecca as the moment of birth approached. "Push now," she instructed. "That's it. You're doing wonderfully." With a final exhausted effort, Rebecca delivered her child, a boy, small but perfectly formed, with a shock of dark hair and lungs that announced his arrival with robust cries. Eleanor cleaned and swaddled him, then placed him in his mother's trembling arms. "He's beautiful," Rebecca whispered, wonder replacing the pain in her eyes. "He's really mine." "What will you name him?" Catherine asked, finally permitted to enter now that the ordeal was over. Rebecca stroked the infant's cheek with a gentle finger. "Thomas," she said softly, "after the brother we never knew." Eleanor felt her throat tighten at the name, William's middle name, chosen to honor a man these women had never met, but whose blood ran in their veins and in the tiny new life now sleeping in Rebecca's arms. Dr. Harrison departed after ensuring mother and child were stable, but not before extending an offer to Eleanor. "Kingston needs a midwife," he said, "and someone with knowledge of medicinal herbs. If you ever consider practicing medicine again, my door is always open." The offer lingered in Eleanor's mind in the days that followed. As she watched Rebecca bond with her son, as she observed Josephine's skilled preparation of healing poultices, as she felt the satisfaction of using her medical knowledge for creation, rather than merely preserving life on battlefields, something stirred within her, a sense of possibility she hadn't felt in years. Catherine's time came next, barely a week after Rebecca's delivery. Her labor was shorter but no less intense, her strong body better equipped for the challenge. She gave birth to a daughter just as dawn broke over the prairie, the first rays of sunlight illuminating the cabin as the child drew her first breath. Unlike Rebecca's dark-haired son, Catherine's daughter had a wisp of auburn hair and eyes that, when briefly opened, showed hints of the Sullivan blue. Reed arrived shortly after the birth, having been sent for by Eleanor. He stood awkwardly at Catherine's bedside, a wrapped package in his hands. "She has William's eyes," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Catherine nodded, a tired smile softening her usually composed features. "What do you have there?" Reed carefully unwrapped the package, revealing a small wooden cradle intricately carved with patterns of leaves and flowers. "I made it," he admitted, "for the baby, if that's all right." Catherine's eyes filled with tears, the first Eleanor had seen from the strong-willed woman. "It's beautiful," she said. "Thank you, Reed." He placed the cradle beside her bed, then hesitated before asking, "Have you chosen a name?" "Eleanor," Catherine said, looking up at Eleanor with uncharacteristic shyness. "If you don't mind." Eleanor found herself unable to speak, overwhelmed by the honor. She simply nodded, blinking back tears of her own. The two newborns brought a new energy to the homestead. The cabin, once silent and shrine-like, now echoed with the sounds of life, babies crying, Rebecca singing lullabies, Josephine chattering to the infants as she worked. Even Catherine, who had always maintained a certain reserve, softened visibly in her daughter's presence. Josephine's time was drawing near, her pregnancy, the least advanced of the three, but progressing rapidly. She showed no fear, only a serene anticipation that Eleanor found remarkable in one so young. "Grandmother always said birth is just another doorway," she explained when Eleanor commented on her calmness. "We've walked through harder ones already." It was true, these women had endured loss, exploitation, fear, yet here they were creating new lives, forging a future from the ashes of their past. Eleanor found herself drawing strength from their resilience, learning from them, even as she guided them. One evening, as summer settled fully over the Nebraska plains, Reed brought news that shifted their world once more. Blackwood had been convicted on multiple charges, including attempted murder, land fraud, and war crimes, based on the documentation Captain Morrison had provided. He would be transported east to serve a lengthy sentence in a federal prison. "It's really over," Rebecca said, cradling baby Thomas as they sat on the newly completed porch of the rebuilt barn. "He can't hurt us anymore." "Not directly," Reed cautioned, "but he still has friends, connections. It's best to remain vigilant." "We will," Catherine said firmly, one hand resting protectively on her daughter's cradle. "We've learned that lesson well enough." The conversation turned to more immediate concerns. The gold in the creek, which preliminary surveys suggested, was a modest but viable deposit. The harvest, which promised to be bountiful thanks to Josephine's careful tending. The upcoming town social, which Eleanor had surprisingly agreed to attend. As twilight deepened into night, Reed excused himself to return to town. Eleanor walked with him to his horse, enjoying the coolness of the evening air after the day's heat. "Dr. Harrison asked about you again," Reed mentioned as he checked his saddle. "He's quite persistent in his offer." Eleanor smiled slightly. "So I've heard. Mrs. Cooper mentioned it when she visited yesterday." "Have you considered it?" Reed asked. "You have a gift, Eleanor, a healing touch that could benefit many." "I've thought about it," she admitted, "but the farm needs attention, and the sisters—" "The sisters are stronger than you think," Reed interrupted gently. "Catherine has taken to farming as if she were born to it. Rebecca manages the household with remarkable efficiency, and Josephine's knowledge of herbs surpasses many trained physicians." He mounted his horse, looking down at her with understanding eyes. "William wouldn't want you to hide your light, Eleanor, not when it could bring healing to others." After he departed, Eleanor remained on the path, gazing up at the vast canopy of stars that blanketed the Nebraska night. Reed's words echoed in her mind, mingling with memories of field hospitals, of hands stained with blood, yet still capable of easing suffering, of a younger Eleanor, who had found purpose in the midst of war's chaos. Perhaps it was time to find that purpose again, not in the crucible of battle, but in the gentler challenges of birth and healing, of easing pain and nurturing life. A cry from the cabin interrupted her thoughts, Josephine's voice high with surprise rather than pain. Eleanor hurried inside to find the youngest sister standing in a puddle of fluid, her face a mixture of shock and excitement. "I think it's time," Josephine said, one hand supporting her belly. "The baby's coming." Josephine's labor progressed with unexpected speed. By midnight, she was fully dilated, her young body working with efficient rhythm to bring forth her child. Unlike Rebecca's fear or Catherine's stoic endurance, Josephine approached birth with an almost mystical acceptance, breathing through contractions with meditative calm. "Grandmother said to welcome the pain," she explained between waves. "It's the price of the miracle." As the night deepened toward dawn, Josephine delivered her child, another boy, fair-haired and delicate, with a birthmark shaped like a crescent moon on his tiny wrist. The same mark Catherine bore, the mark William had described in his journal. "Jonathan," Josephine whispered, naming him for the grandfather he would never know. "Welcome to our family." With all three babies safely delivered, the homestead settled into a new rhythm. The barn was completed, stronger and more spacious than its predecessor. The gold claim was registered and preliminary mining begun, with Reed overseeing the legal arrangements to ensure Eleanor and the sisters received their fair share of any profits. Summer faded into autumn, painting the prairie in rich hues of gold and crimson. The harvest was brought in the pantry, stocked for winter. The babies thrived, growing stronger each day under the watchful eyes of their mothers and the protective care of their extended family. Eleanor found herself drawn more frequently to town, first to assist Dr. Harrison with a difficult case, then to tend a miner's infected wound, then to deliver the blacksmith's wife of twins. Each time she used her medical skills, she felt more of her old self returning, not the grief-stricken widow, but the capable nurse who had once faced death without flinching and often won. On a crisp October morning, almost 6 months to the day since she had purchased 3 pregnant women at an auction, Eleanor stood before William's grave. The wooden cross still stood, but now the small plot was bordered with flowering plants, Josephine's doing, and the ground was free of weeds. "I'm not sure you'd recognize me now, William," she said softly. "I'm not sure I recognize myself sometimes." She placed a fresh bouquet of wildflowers at the base of the cross, replacing the blood-stained bandage that had been her ritual offering for so long. The old fabric had been burned months ago, along with other relics of grief too heavy to carry forward. "We have a family now," she continued. "Your family, though you never knew them. They've brought life back to this place, back to me." She touched the cross gently. "I'll always love you, always honor your memory, but I think it's time I started living again, not just surviving." From behind her came the sound of approaching footsteps, Reed coming to escort her to town for her first official day as Kingston's midwife and assistant to Dr. Harrison. He had taken the position with the Territorial Marshal's office, but delayed his departure, finding reasons to remain in Kingston. His courtship of Catherine was proceeding with deliberate patience, respecting her need to heal and adjust to motherhood. "Ready?" he asked, standing respectfully at a distance from the grave. Eleanor nodded, taking a final moment with William before turning away. "Yes," she said. "I'm ready." When they walked toward the waiting wagon, Eleanor glanced back at the homestead. Rebecca sat on the porch nursing Thomas while singing a gentle lullaby. Catherine was in the corral instructing a local boy and caring for the horses while she would be busy with harvest. Josephine knelt in her herb garden, little Jonathan sleeping in a basket beside her as she gathered the last of the season's medicinal plants. The scene struck Eleanor with its simple beauty, this family forged not by blood alone, but by shared suffering and survival, by choices made in moments of crisis, by hands reaching out when it would have been easier to turn away. 5 years ago, she had come to this land with William full of hopes for their future. That future had died with him, buried beneath the prairie soil along with their unborn child. For years, she had existed as a ghost in her own life, moving through days without purpose or passion. Now, as autumn light gilded the homestead, Eleanor Sullivan looked at the family she had found and felt truly alive. The grief hadn't vanished, it never would completely, but it had transformed, becoming part of a larger tapestry that included joy and purpose, love and possibility. As she and Reed reached the wagon, Eleanor heard Rebecca's voice rise in song, a sweet, clear melody that carried across the prairie. The same song William had often hummed, the one that had first caught Eleanor's attention when Rebecca sang it in the cabin all those months ago. "She has a beautiful voice," Reed commented as he helped Eleanor into the wagon. "Yes," Eleanor agreed, "a true gift." She settled onto the seat, adjusting her medical bag beside her. "I've been thinking about the new school Kingston is planning. The children will need music instruction." Reed smiled, understanding her meaning. "Another healing art." "Different wounds, same principle," Eleanor replied. "We all have our ways of mending what's broken." As the wagon pulled away from the homestead, Eleanor felt a sense of rightness settle over her. She wasn't abandoning William's dream by moving forward. She was honoring it in the best way possible, by creating the family he had always wanted, by using her gifts to ease suffering, by finding joy in the life they had once planned together. The prairie stretched before them, vast and golden under the autumn sun. Somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark trilled its sweet song. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly, savoring the moment, the wind on her face, the promise of useful work ahead, the knowledge that at day's end she would return to a home filled with life and love. This was enough. This was everything. Winter came early to Nebraska that year, blanketing the prairie in pristine white. The homestead stood strong against the cold smoke rising from the chimney lanterns, glowing warmly in the windows. Inside, life continued its dance, babies growing, relationships deepening, futures unfolding. Eleanor divided her time between her medical practice in town and her family at the homestead. The gold mine had proven modestly profitable, providing security without the corrupting influence of sudden wealth. Reed visited regularly, his courtship of Catherine progressing toward an understanding, if not yet a formal engagement. On Christmas Eve, the first Eleanor had truly celebrated since William's death, the family gathered in the cabin. A small pine tree stood in the corner, decorated with handmade ornaments and candles. Gifts were exchanged, practical items, mostly, with a few treasures mixed in a new journal. For Eleanor, hand-knitted blankets for the babies, a carved wooden box for Rebecca's sewing supplies, a silver locket for Catherine from Reed, though he presented it with studied casualness, a book of botanical illustrations for Josephine. After a simple but festive meal, They sat before the fire while Rebecca sang carols, her voice filling the cabin with beauty. The babies, now 6 months old, were passed from lap to lap, admired and cuddled and loved by all. Outside, snow fell gently, wrapping the world in hushed tranquility. Eleanor watched her family, for that was how she thought of them now, without qualification or explanation, and felt a profound sense of peace. The journey from grief to healing had been long and often painful, marked by unexpected turns and dangers she could never have anticipated. Yet here they were, gathered together on a holy night, creating new memories and traditions that honored the past while embracing the future. William was present in the blue of Catherine's eyes, in the line of Reed's jaw, in the stories they told, and the love they shared. As midnight approached, Eleanor stepped onto the porch to breathe the crisp winter air. The storm had passed, leaving a crystalline sky ablaze with stars. The prairie stretched away, a vast expanse of silver beneath the moon's cool light. She thought of that day in April, kneeling at William's grave with a blood-stained bandage and a heart empty of everything but grief. How far she had come since then. How far they all had come, these broken souls who had found each other at an auction block and forged a family from the fragments of their lives. Eleanor lifted her face to the star-filled sky, allowing gratitude to wash through her. For William, whose love had shaped her life even in his absence. For Catherine, Rebecca, and Josephine's sisters, who had brought purpose back to her days. For Reed, who had watched over her from afar and now stood beside her openly. For little Thomas, Eleanor, and Jonathan, new lives, carrying forward the legacy of those who had gone before. The door opened behind her, spilling warm light onto the porch. Reed stood in the doorway, his face softened by the gentle illumination. "Everything all right?" he asked. Eleanor nodded, smiling. "Everything is perfect." He came to stand beside her as both of them gazing out at the winter landscape. "It's a beautiful night," he observed. "Yes," Eleanor agreed. "Beautiful." They stood in companionable silence, two people who had found each other through shared loss and were now building something new from the ashes of grief. Inside, Rebecca began singing again, a lullaby, this time soft and sweet in the quiet night. Eleanor closed her eyes, letting the music wash over her. The song of the prairie wind through grass, children's laughter, women's voices raised in work and joy. This was her home now. Not a shrine to the past, but a living, breathing place where life continued its eternal cycle of loss and renewal. William had given her this land, this dream of open skies and fresh beginnings. She had nearly lost it to grief, then nearly lost it again to Blackwood's greed. But here it remained, transformed by struggle and love into something more precious than she could have imagined. "We should go in," Reed said softly. "It's getting colder." Eleanor nodded, taking one last look at the star-strewn sky before turning toward the warm light of home. "Yes," she said, "let's go in." Together they stepped back into the cabin, closing the door against the winter night. Inside, the family waited, Catherine with her quiet strength, Rebecca with her healing music, Josephine with her visionary wisdom, and the babies' 3 new lives carrying forward all their hopes and dreams. As the year drew to its close and a new one waited on the horizon, Eleanor Sullivan looked at the family she had found and knew that whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, they would face them together. In this knowledge was a peace she had thought lost forever. Not the numb absence of feeling that had sustained her for so long, but a true, deep serenity born of love and purpose. Outside, the wind sang its ancient song across the Nebraska plains, carrying whispers of those who had gone before and promises of those yet to come. But inside, surrounded by her family, Eleanor finally understood what William had meant when he wrote of home as the place where healing begins. This was it. This was home. This was enough.